Before Isaiah became the prophet whose words would echo through synagogues, churches, royal courts, and generations yet unborn, he lived in a kingdom that appeared far stronger than it really was. Jerusalem still stood. The temple still dominated the sacred life of Judah. Priests continued their sacrifices. Pilgrims still climbed toward the city of David. The throne had not yet disappeared, and the armies of a foreign empire had not yet surrounded Jerusalem's walls. From the outside, Judah could still look secure, but Isaiah would spend his life exposing a more dangerous reality. A nation can survive enemies at its borders and still be collapsing within. Long before Babylon carried Judah into exile, long before Jerusalem burned, and long before Isaiah's words about a suffering servant, a righteous king, and a restored people became some of the most recognized prophecies in Scripture, the prophet confronted a problem much closer to home. Judah had religion, but religion alone had not produced faithfulness. The people brought sacrifices while injustice spread. They gathered for worship while the vulnerable were neglected. Leaders possessed power, but not always righteousness. Wealth could increase while compassion disappeared. Public devotion could remain impressive even as covenant loyalty weakened beneath the surface. And above all of it stood the question that would define Isaiah's ministry. What happens when a people continue the forms of worship but resist the God they claim to worship? The book of Isaiah opens not with Isaiah's birth, childhood, or family history, but with a vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem during the reigns of 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That introduction immediately places Isaiah inside a period of enormous change. He was not speaking into an empty wilderness. He was speaking into history. To understand his calling, we first have to understand the world into which he was called. Judah was the southern kingdom that remained after the ancient united monarchy of Israel had divided generations earlier. Jerusalem was its capital. The dynasty of David continued to rule there, carrying with it memories of promises concerning David's house. To the north stood the separate kingdom of Israel, often called Ephraim in prophetic literature because Ephraim was one of its dominant tribes. Beyond both kingdoms were larger powers. Aram, centered in Damascus, repeatedly influenced the politics of the region. Egypt remained a symbol of ancient power to the southwest, but increasingly, one empire overshadowed all of them: Assyria. From Mesopotamia, Assyrian kings were building a military machine capable of crushing cities, uprooting populations, demanding tribute, and turning smaller kingdoms into dependent states. During Isaiah's lifetime, Assyria would cease to be a distant name. It would become a force capable of changing the entire political map. Yet when Isaiah's story first comes into focus, Judah had recently experienced something very different from national collapse. It had experienced prosperity. King Uzziah, also known as Azariah in Kings, reigned for decades. 2 Chronicles describes him as a ruler who strengthened Judah militarily, developed defenses, expanded agricultural interests, and achieved significant success. For a generation looking only at political stability, Uzziah's reign could appear reassuring. The kingdom had a functioning government, its defenses had improved, its king had become powerful. But Scripture refuses to equate prosperity with spiritual health. Uzziah's own story became a warning. 2 Chronicles records that after he became strong, pride contributed to his downfall. He entered the temple and attempted to burn incense, a priestly act that was not assigned to the king. When confronted by the priests, he resisted them, and he was struck with a serious skin disease. For the remainder of his life, he lived separated from normal royal and temple life, while his son Jotham administered the palace and governed the people. The man whose reign symbolized strength ended his years marked by human limitation. For Isaiah's generation, that contrast mattered. Political achievement had not erased the need for obedience. Success had not placed a king above the holiness of God. And the same principle would soon confront the entire nation. The opening chapter of Isaiah reads like a covenant lawsuit. Heaven and earth are called to witness. God describes a people he has raised who have rebelled against him. The imagery is intentionally severe. Even an ox recognizes its owner, Isaiah says in effect, and a donkey knows where it is fed. Yet Israel does not truly understand the one to whom it belongs. The problem is not ignorance in the ordinary sense. These are people surrounded by sacred tradition. They know the temple. They know sacrifices. They know appointed festivals. They know prayers. Yet Isaiah attacks the assumption that religious activity can substitute for covenant faithfulness. Sacrifices are being offered, but bloodshed stains society. Hands can be lifted in prayer while those same hands participate in injustice. The prophet calls for something far deeper than ceremony. Wash yourselves, turn from evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. This is one of the most important foundations for understanding Isaiah. He is not merely the prophet who predicts distant events. He is the prophet who insists that holiness has consequences in ordinary human life. Worship and justice cannot be permanently separated. A people cannot claim loyalty to God while treating the weak as disposable. Isaiah's prophecies about nations, kings, exile, restoration, and the future must therefore be understood against this moral and covenant background. Judah's greatest danger was not Assyria alone. Assyria would become terrifying. But Isaiah repeatedly points toward a deeper danger, a nation becoming so accustomed to outward religion that it can no longer recognize its own rebellion. The prophet describes Jerusalem with language of grief. The faithful city has become corrupted. Righteousness once associated with the city is now contrasted with violence and unfaithfulness. Its leaders are accused of loving bribes and pursuing gain. The powerful thrive while the vulnerable struggle to receive justice. This does not mean every individual in Jerusalem was equally corrupt. Prophetic language often addresses the character and direction of the community as a whole. But the warning is unmistakable. Judgment is not random. It has moral causes. And yet already in these opening words, Isaiah introduces another theme that will remain with him for the rest of his ministry. Judgment is not the entire story. Isaiah speaks of cleansing. He speaks of restoration. He speaks of Zion being redeemed through justice. The same prophetic voice that announces consequences also holds out the possibility of renewal. That tension, judgment, and hope will never disappear from Isaiah's message. His book can move from terrifying warnings to visions of peace, from ruined cities to a restored Jerusalem, from human pride brought low to the exaltation of the Lord, from war to nations learning peace, from a devastated land to imagery of new growth. Isaiah sees both the seriousness of rebellion and the persistence of divine purpose. One of his early visions looks beyond the instability of his own century toward a future in which the mountain of the house of the Lord is exalted and nations come seeking instruction. Weapons of war are transformed into tools of cultivation. The nations are pictured as learning another way. But Isaiah does not use this vision to encourage complacency. Future hope becomes a reason for present faithfulness. If God's purpose is justice and peace, then Judah cannot comfortably live in arrogance, violence, and idolatry. Isaiah repeatedly attacks pride. Human beings exalt themselves. Nations glorify military power. The wealthy trust what they possess. People create idols with their own hands and then bow before what they have made. But Isaiah sees a day when human arrogance will be brought low. This theme will become especially important once Assyria enters the story more fully. For Judah may be tempted to fear Assyria as though an empire were ultimate. Isaiah will insist that it is not. At other moments, Judah will be tempted to trust political alliances as though clever diplomacy were ultimate. Isaiah will insist that it is not. Kings rise, empires expand, cities fall, but none of them occupies the throne Isaiah is about to see. Before that moment comes, however, the prophet gives one of Scripture's most memorable descriptions of a society consumed by excess. He speaks of houses added to houses and fields joined to fields as powerful landowners accumulate property. He condemns those who pursue drunken pleasure while ignoring the works of God. He denounces people who reverse moral categories, calling evil good and good evil, darkness light and light darkness. He warns those who are wise in their own eyes. He condemns those who justify the guilty for reward and deprive the innocent of justice. These are not disconnected complaints. Together they reveal a civilization losing the ability to judge itself truthfully. That is why Isaiah's ministry will often sound confrontational. A prophet does not merely tell a nation what will happen. A prophet tells a nation what it has become. And sometimes that message is harder to hear. The early chapters use the image of a vineyard to express this tragedy. The owner carefully prepares the land. He clears stones, he plants choice vines, he builds what is necessary and expects good fruit. But the vineyard produces something worthless. Isaiah then identifies the vineyard with Israel and Judah. God looked for justice, but found bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. The image makes the coming judgment more comprehensible. The problem was not lack of care. It was the rejection of that care. The nation had received covenant privileges, instruction, leadership, and worship. Yet those gifts had not produced the fruit expected from them. The Vineyard Song also introduces one of Isaiah's recurring patterns. Blessing brings responsibility. Privilege does not make judgment impossible. It makes faithfulness more necessary. And then the narrative reaches a date Isaiah's audience would have remembered: the year King Uzziah died. For decades, Uzziah had represented continuity. Whether one remembered his military strength, his prosperity, his long reign, or the tragic pride that marked his later life, he had been part of Judah's world for a very long time. Now he was gone. A throne on earth had become empty. And in that year, Isaiah saw another throne. I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. The scene in Isaiah 6 shifts dramatically from the corruption of Judah to the holiness of heaven. The earthly king has died. The heavenly king has not. The vision is not presented as though Isaiah were describing God exhaustively. It is a prophetic vision, communicating divine majesty in human language. The train of the Lord's robe fills the temple. Seraphim stand above him. These mysterious heavenly beings cover their faces with 2 wings, cover their feet with 2, and fly with 2. And they call to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The foundations shake at the sound. The house fills with smoke. This is where Isaiah's prophetic ministry becomes personal. Until now, he has spoken about a sinful nation, a rebellious people, corrupt leaders, unjust judges, proud men, idolatrous communities. But standing before divine holiness changes the focus. Isaiah does not first say, "Woe to them." He says, "Woe is me." That shift matters. The prophet who will confront kings and nations begins by being confronted himself. He recognizes his own uncleanness. He describes himself as a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips. For a prophet, lips matter. His vocation will depend upon speech. His words will announce judgment, comfort, warning, promise, and hope. Yet before he can speak on behalf of the Holy One, Isaiah becomes aware of the impurity of the very instrument he will use. This scene prevents us from imagining Isaiah as a self-appointed moral superior. He does not stand outside Judah's problem. He belongs to the people he will address. He too needs cleansing. Then one of the seraphim flies toward him with a burning coal taken from the altar. The coal touches Isaiah's mouth. The vision announces that his guilt has been taken away and his sin atoned for. The order is important. Isaiah sees holiness. He recognizes his sin. He receives cleansing. Only then comes the commission. The prophet's authority does not begin with his personal greatness. It begins with grace. Then Isaiah hears the voice of the Lord, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Isaiah answers with words that would become famous far beyond their original context. "Here I am, send me." Taken alone, the sentence sounds triumphant. It has inspired sermons, missionary appeals, hymns, and countless reflections on willingness and calling. But in Isaiah 6, the story does not stop with the willingness of the messenger. The assignment comes next, and the assignment is severe. Isaiah is sent to a people who will hear but resist understanding, see but fail to perceive. The language is difficult because it describes a ministry in which repeated prophetic warning becomes connected with hardened resistance. Isaiah will speak truth, but truth will not automatically produce repentance. The prophet has volunteered for a mission whose apparent results may often look like failure. He will warn people who refuse warning. He will confront rulers who prefer political calculations. He will describe coming judgment while daily life continues. He will speak of hope while destruction seems closer. And the more his words expose the spiritual condition of the nation, the more serious the consequences become. Isaiah asks the question any messenger might ask after receiving such a commission. How long, O Lord? How long must he speak to people who will not listen? The answer offers no easy optimism. Until cities lie waste, until houses are without inhabitants, until the land is largely desolate. Isaiah's ministry will unfold beneath the shadow of coming devastation. But once again, the prophecy does not end with complete annihilation. A remnant remains. Even after the tree is cut down, a stump is left, and within that stump is what Isaiah calls a holy seed. Here in the very chapter describing resistance and judgment, another major theme appears: the remnant. Isaiah's message will repeatedly return to the idea that judgment can be devastating without canceling God's purpose. Something survives, a people remain, a promise continues. A stump may look dead to the eye, yet it can still contain the future. Isaiah did not yet know every confrontation that lay ahead in the unfolding narrative. Kings would face him. Foreign armies would reshape the region. Israel in the north would fall. Jerusalem itself would tremble before Assyria. One king would reject a sign. Another would carry a threatening letter into the presence of God. Isaiah would speak of a child called Immanuel, of a coming ruler associated with extraordinary titles, of a shoot rising from the stump of Jesse, of a servant whose suffering would become central to later Christian understanding, and of a future creation in which the language of restoration would reach almost cosmic proportions. But none of those prophecies can be understood properly without this beginning. Isaiah first encountered the king before he addressed kings. He first confessed his own uncleanness before denouncing the sins of others. He first received cleansing before receiving commission. And he learned from the beginning that a divine calling does not guarantee an easy audience. Sometimes obedience means speaking when people refuse to hear. Sometimes faithfulness means warning a nation that still believes it is secure. Sometimes hope must be proclaimed while the axe is already near the tree. The year Uzziah died, Judah lost a king who had helped define an era. Isaiah saw the throne that no death could empty, and from that encounter came a mission that would carry him into the center of one of the most dangerous political transformations Judah had ever faced. Because while Jerusalem continued its rituals, while nobles accumulated wealth, while rulers calculated alliances, another power was moving westward. Assyria was coming. Its armies had not yet reached the gates of Jerusalem, but the storm had already begun. And soon Isaiah would discover that speaking about holiness inside the temple was only the beginning. He would have to carry that message into the world of kings, diplomacy, fear, invasion, and decisions capable of changing the destiny of Judah. Isaiah's calling did not remove him from history, it pushed him deeper into it. The vision in the temple had revealed the true center of reality, the throne of God, the holiness of the one Isaiah would serve, and the seriousness of the message he had been commissioned to carry. But once the smoke of that vision gave way to ordinary life, Isaiah still had to walk through the streets of Jerusalem. He still had to speak to people who bought land, raised children, argued in courts, made political alliances, worshipped in the temple, and worried about armies beyond the horizon. A prophet could stand before the throne in a vision, but he still had to stand before kings in the real world. And the world Isaiah entered was becoming more dangerous by the year. After Uzziah's death, his son Jotham continued the Davidic line. Jotham is remembered in Kings and Chronicles as a ruler who generally did what was right before the Lord, although the people continued in corrupt practices and the high places were not fully removed. That tension is important. A relatively faithful king could not automatically produce a faithful society. Judah's spiritual condition was larger than one ruler. The habits Isaiah condemned, pride, injustice, shallow worship, and misplaced trust, had become embedded in the life of the nation. At the same time, pressure from outside Judah was increasing. The Assyrian Empire was expanding aggressively under Tiglath-Pileser III. Assyria's method was simple in principle and devastating in practice. Smaller kingdoms could submit, pay tribute, and accept a reduced level of independence. Or they could resist. Resistance could mean invasion, siege, destruction, deportation, and the replacement of local rulers. For small states in the Levant, survival often depended on deciding which larger power to fear and which alliance to trust. This political reality would become the setting for some of Isaiah's most important prophecies. But Isaiah did not interpret politics the way royal advisors did. To them, the central question was often, which alliance will keep us alive? To Isaiah, the deeper question was, will Judah trust the Lord when fear makes every political alternative appear more practical? That conflict between fear and faith would soon reach the throne. Before it did, Isaiah's own household became part of his prophetic ministry. The book tells us that Isaiah had children whose names carried symbolic meaning. One son was named Shir-Yashub. The name can be understood as a remnant shall return. It was not merely a private family name, it carried theology. Judgment was coming, but judgment would not mean total destruction. A remnant would remain. Some would return. The name embodied one of the most persistent themes in Isaiah's message. Later, another son would receive an even more unsettling name, Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, a phrase associated with the rapid coming of plunder and spoil. Isaiah's family was living inside the message he proclaimed. His children became signs. The prophet's ministry was not confined to speeches. Even names in his household reminded Judah that history was moving toward both judgment and preservation. This raises a difficult reality about prophetic life. Isaiah could not separate his vocation completely from his family. His public mission entered his private world. The crisis confronting Judah was not an abstract theological debate. It would determine what kind of nation his children inherited. And soon, it would come very close. As Jotham's reign gave way to that of his son Ahaz, the political pressure intensified. Ahaz inherited the throne of Judah at a dangerous time. To the north, the kingdom of Israel, often called Ephraim, was ruled by Pekah. Farther north, Aram was ruled by Rezin from Damascus. Both kingdoms had reason to fear Assyria. They needed allies. Judah mattered because of its strategic position. Rezin and Pekah wanted Ahaz to join their anti-Assyrian coalition. But Ahaz did not cooperate. What followed became one of the defining crises of Isaiah's ministry. Aram and Israel moved against Judah. The purpose was not merely to raid the countryside. Isaiah 7 describes a plan to break Judah's resistance, remove the existing Davidic ruler, and install another king. For the house of David, this was more than a border conflict. It was a threat to the dynasty itself. The news reached Jerusalem. Aram had allied itself with Ephraim. The reaction is described with one of Isaiah's most vivid images. The heart of Ahaz and the hearts of his people shook as trees of the forest shake before the wind. Fear had entered Jerusalem. This is the kind of moment in which political logic feels irresistible. An enemy coalition is approaching. The capital may be threatened. The king is responsible for the survival of the kingdom. Military weakness can quickly become dynastic collapse. Ahaz needed an answer, and Isaiah was sent to meet him. The setting is significant. Isaiah was told to go with his son Shear-Yashub and meet Ahaz near the conduit of the upper pool on the road to the washer's field. The king appears to have been dealing with the city's water supply, something entirely understandable in anticipation of military attack. Jerusalem's survival in a siege depended partly on access to water. Ahaz was preparing. Isaiah approached him in the middle of those preparations. Imagine the contrast. Workers concerned with infrastructure, royal officials calculating defense, rumors of enemy movement. A king under pressure. And into that atmosphere comes a prophet with a child whose name means that a remnant will return. Isaiah's first instruction to Ahaz is almost shocking in its calmness. Be careful. Be quiet. Do not fear. Do not let your heart become weak because of Rezin and Pekah. The two enemy kings who terrified Jerusalem are compared to smoking firebrands. They look dangerous. They have heat, but they are already burning down toward their end. Isaiah does not deny the threat. He redefines it. Aram and Ephraim have made plans against Judah. They intend to invade, terrify, divide the kingdom, and establish their own preferred ruler. But Isaiah declares that their plan will not ultimately stand. The political coalition frightening Ahaz is temporary. The prophet then gives the king one of the central challenges of his ministry. If you do not stand firm in faith, you will not stand at all. That idea lies at the heart of Isaiah's confrontation with Judah's kings. Faith in this context is not passive optimism. It is not pretending that enemy armies do not exist. It is a refusal to treat those armies as the final authority over history. Isaiah is asking Ahaz to believe that the future of David's dynasty is not controlled by Rezin, Pekah, or even Assyria. This is where the story becomes more complicated, because Ahaz does have another option. And from the perspective of ancient realpolitik, it may seem far more sensible. Assyria. If two smaller kingdoms are threatening Judah, why not appeal to the great empire both of those kingdoms fear? Why not use a larger enemy to destroy smaller enemies? It is a strategy rulers have used throughout history, but every powerful ally has a price, and Isaiah sees the price more clearly than Ahaz does. The immediate crisis is therefore not only military, it is spiritual. Who will define Judah's security? Will Ahaz trust the word given through Isaiah? Or will he make Judah dependent upon the empire that is swallowing the region one kingdom at a time? The answer will shape generations. Before Ahaz makes his decisive move, Isaiah's ministry demonstrates another important feature. Prophecy often works on more than one timescale. Some of Isaiah's words address immediate political events. Others look beyond those events. Some use historical crises as the setting for promises whose significance will grow as later generations read them. This is one reason Isaiah has become both influential and difficult. If every prophecy is removed from its 8th century context, the book becomes disconnected from the real people Isaiah addressed. But if every prophecy is restricted only to the immediate crisis, the way later biblical writers use Isaiah becomes difficult to explain. The task is to let the text speak at each level without collapsing those levels into one. That becomes especially important in the confrontation with Ahaz. The Lord tells Ahaz to ask for a sign. The offer is astonishingly broad. Ask for something deep below or high above. Ahaz appears to respond with humility. I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. The words sound religious, but Isaiah does not praise him. Instead, the prophet rebukes the house of David. Why? Because in this situation, Ahaz is not refusing an illegitimate test. He is refusing a sign that God himself has offered. His religious language hides something else. He has already begun to look in another direction. This is one of Isaiah's most penetrating themes. Unbelief does not always sound openly rebellious. Sometimes it sounds cautious, sometimes practical, sometimes even pious. A person can use religious language while avoiding the very act of trust that obedience requires. Isaiah responds that the Lord himself will give a sign. A young woman will conceive and bear a son, and his name will be called Immanuel. The name means God with us. Few passages in Isaiah have generated more discussion. Within the immediate setting, the sign belongs to the crisis facing Ahaz and the house of David. Isaiah's message is connected to the near future. The threatened kings will not remain a permanent danger. Before the child associated with the sign reaches a particular stage of moral awareness, the lands of the two kings Ahaz fears will be devastated. The prophecy therefore speaks into a real political emergency. Ahaz is being told that the coalition terrifying him will not determine Judah's destiny. But the prophecy does not end with simple reassurance. The very empire Ahaz may use to escape the crisis will eventually become a source of suffering. Assyria will come. The instrument chosen for security will become an instrument of humiliation. This is the bitter irony of Ahaz's strategy. He fears Aram and Israel. He turns toward Assyria. Assyria destroys Aram and Israel. Then Assyria's shadow stretches over Judah. The solution contains the next crisis. Later, the Gospel of Matthew will quote Isaiah's Immanuel passage in relation to the birth of Jesus. That later use has shaped Christian reading of Isaiah for centuries. But to understand why the connection carries such force, we must first allow the original setting to remain visible. The sign is given to the house of David in a moment when that dynasty appears threatened. The question is whether God remains present with his people when political events seem to place his promises in danger. That theme, God with us, will continue far beyond Ahaz. But in Isaiah's own day, the king standing before him must decide what he believes. And Ahaz chooses politics over prophetic trust. 2 Kings tells us that he sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. His appeal is painfully revealing. He calls himself the Assyrian king's servant and son. He asks Assyria to save him from Aram and Israel. He sends silver and gold taken from the temple and the royal treasury as tribute. Judah buys protection, and Assyria responds. Damascus is attacked. Rezin is killed. Aram's power is broken. From the immediate perspective of royal policy, Ahaz's decision appears successful. The enemy threatening Judah is defeated. A crisis has been solved. This is exactly why Isaiah's warning matters. Bad decisions do not always produce immediate disaster. Sometimes they work first. Sometimes a compromise appears successful before its deeper cost becomes visible. Ahaz survives, but Judah's independence is weakened. The temple itself begins to reflect foreign influence. After traveling to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, Ahaz sees an altar there and sends its pattern back to Jerusalem. A similar altar is constructed. The arrangement of sacred space is altered. The king who refused God's offered sign becomes increasingly shaped by the empire whose help he purchased. Political dependence and religious compromise begin to overlap. 2 Chronicles presents Ahaz even more severely, describing widespread idolatry and unfaithfulness during his reign. Judah suffers military losses. Enemies attack. The king turns to foreign gods rather than returning in repentance. The crisis is not merely that Ahaz made one poor diplomatic decision. His reign represents a deeper pattern. Fear leads to misplaced trust. Misplaced trust leads to compromise. Compromise reshapes worship, and what begins as a response to one emergency becomes part of the spiritual direction of the nation. Isaiah continues speaking. His message grows darker. The child with the symbolic name Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz becomes part of another prophetic sign. Before the child is old enough to speak the ordinary words for father and mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. Again, Isaiah is tying prophecy to events his audience will live to see. The timeline is moving. Assyria will defeat the coalition, but Isaiah describes Assyria through powerful imagery. The empire is like a river rising beyond its banks. Because the people have rejected quieter waters, overwhelming waters will come. The flood will sweep through the land. It will reach into Judah. The image becomes terrifying. Water rising toward the neck, a nation nearly submerged. And then Isaiah invokes the same name connected with the earlier sign, Immanuel, God with us. This creates another tension central to the book. If God is with Judah, why will Judah suffer? Isaiah does not offer the shallow answer that divine presence means the absence of consequences. God's presence does not make rebellion harmless. The nation can experience discipline without the covenant story disappearing. The waters may rise, the land may be invaded, the people may tremble, but Assyria is still not God. Its power is not ultimate, its plans are not final. Isaiah warns against joining the fear that dominates public life. Do not fear what everyone else fears, he says in effect. Regard the Lord as holy. This is Isaiah 6, carried into politics. The holiness Isaiah saw in the temple now determines how he responds to international crisis. The throne he saw above all earthly power becomes the reason he refuses to treat Assyria as supreme. Yet many in Judah will not accept this vision. Some will turn toward mediums and occult practices. Some will search anywhere for guidance except where Isaiah directs them. The prophet describes a people moving through distress and darkness. The language becomes heavy, hungry, angry, looking upward, looking toward the earth, seeing distressed darkness and fearful gloom. It is one of the darkest transitions in the early part of Isaiah. And then suddenly hope breaks through. The people walking in darkness are described as seeing a great light. A region once humbled is promised honor. Oppression will not last forever. The imagery moves from darkness to joy, from burden to liberation. And at the center of the promise is a child. For unto us a child is born. The language surrounding this child is extraordinary. Authority rests upon him. His rule is associated with names and titles expressing wisdom, divine, power, enduring care, and peace. He will reign on David's throne. His government and peace will increase. Justice and righteousness will characterize his kingdom. For Isaiah's first hearers, this promise stood against the failure of rulers like Ahaz. Judah needed more than a king who knew how to negotiate survival. The Davidic ideal had become a theological question. What kind of ruler could actually establish justice? What kind of king could govern without fear? What kind of son of David could embody the righteous rule the nation repeatedly failed to produce? Christian readers would later see this passage fulfilled in Jesus. But again, the power of that interpretation depends on understanding the historical contrast Isaiah is creating. Ahaz sits on David's throne. Yet Ahaz does not represent the final hope of David's house. Isaiah is looking beyond the inadequacy of the present king. That hope expands again in Isaiah 11. A shoot will come from the stump of Jesse. The image is deliberate. Jesse was David's father. A stump suggests that something once great has been cut down. The monarchy may appear reduced. The dynasty may seem threatened. But new life can emerge from what looks finished. The Spirit of the Lord rests upon this coming figure. Wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, the fear of the Lord. He judges not merely by outward appearances, he defends the poor with righteousness. His reign is described with images of extraordinary peace. The wolf with the lamb, the leopard with the young goat, danger transformed, violence restrained, the earth filled with the knowledge of the Lord. Isaiah's prophetic horizon is becoming larger. He began with the sins of Jerusalem. He stood before the holiness of God. He confronted Ahaz during a military emergency, but his vision is already extending beyond immediate survival. The crisis of one king reveals the inadequacy of human kingship. The threat against one dynasty opens a wider question about the future of David's line. The shadow of one empire forces Isaiah to speak about the limits of all earthly power. This is how Isaiah's prophecies grow. History does not disappear. History becomes the stage on which larger themes emerge. Meanwhile, Assyria continues moving. Damascus falls. Aram's independence collapses. The northern kingdom of Israel loses territory and stability. Its final destruction has not yet occurred, but the direction is unmistakable. The world Ahaz knew is being dismantled. Judah has survived the Syro-Ephraimite crisis, but survival has come at a cost. The Assyrian king has been invited into the region as Judah's protector, and empires rarely remain satisfied with gratitude. Tribute can become obligation. Obligation can become domination. Domination can become invasion. Isaiah knows the danger is not over. The storm has merely changed direction. One enemy has been removed, another has moved closer. And in the years ahead, the northern kingdom that once marched against Jerusalem will itself disappear beneath Assyria's expansion. Samaria will fall. Families will be uprooted. A kingdom that had existed for generations will cease to function as an independent state. When that happens, Judah will no longer be able to imagine Isaiah's warnings as distant rhetoric. The evidence will stand immediately to the north. A nation can fall. A capital can be captured. A covenant people can experience devastating judgment. And once Israel falls, only Judah will remain under a Davidic king. The pressure on Jerusalem will become greater. So will the question Isaiah has been asking from the beginning. What do you trust when everything around you is changing? A coalition, an empire, treasury, wealth, fortified walls, foreign gods, human wisdom, or the Holy One whose throne Isaiah saw in the year Uzziah died? Ahaz chose his answer. But the story of Judah was not finished with Ahaz. Another king would come. His name was Hezekiah, and unlike his father, he would become closely associated with reform, prayer, and one of the most dramatic confrontations with Assyria recorded in Scripture. Yet before Hezekiah could face the empire at Jerusalem's gates, Isaiah's warning had to be confirmed in a way no one in Judah could ignore. To the north, Samaria was running out of time. The kingdom of Israel was approaching its final collapse, and when it fell, the political world of Isaiah would never be the same again. The fall of Samaria did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It came through years of pressure, political instability, rebellion, failed alliances, and the steady advance of Assyria. For generations, the northern kingdom of Israel had existed beside Judah as a separate monarchy. Its kings had risen and fallen. Its prophets had warned. Its borders had expanded and contracted. At times, Israel had been strong enough to intimidate Judah. But by Isaiah's lifetime, the balance of power had changed completely. Assyria was no longer merely one kingdom among many. It was becoming the empire that decided which smaller nations survived. The northern kingdom had already lost territory under Tiglath-Pileser III. Populations had been deported. Political independence had been reduced. Leadership became unstable. Then Hoshea became king of Israel. 2 Kings describes him as ruling under Assyrian pressure. At first he paid tribute, but eventually he sought another path. He stopped sending the required payment to Assyria and looked toward Egypt for support. The choice reveals the same political instinct Isaiah had confronted in Judah. When one empire becomes threatening, find another power strong enough to balance it. But this strategy failed. The Assyrian king arrested Hoshea. Then the Assyrian army invaded the land and laid siege to Samaria. For 3 years the capital endured, and then it fell. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent monarchy. People were deported into regions of the Assyrian Empire, while other populations would eventually be resettled in portions of the conquered territory. The political world of the divided monarchy had changed permanently. For Judah, the lesson should have been impossible to miss. The kingdom that once threatened Jerusalem alongside Aram was gone. The capital of Samaria had fallen, its king had been removed, its people had been scattered. This was not a story from centuries earlier. It was happening within Isaiah's historical world. And according to the biblical writers, Israel's destruction could not be explained only by military weakness. 2 Kings interprets the fall theologically. Israel had repeatedly violated the covenant. The people practiced idolatry. They adopted customs condemned in the law. They rejected prophetic warnings. They continued in patterns of disobedience even when messengers called them back. The text does not deny Assyria's military power. Assyria was real. Its armies were real. Its policies of deportation were real. Its expansion can be understood in political and historical terms. But the biblical account asks a deeper question. Why had Israel reached the point where judgment took this form? The answer is not that the Assyrians were more righteous. The prophets never make that claim. The issue is Israel's own covenant unfaithfulness. That distinction becomes increasingly important in Isaiah. An empire can be used within judgment without becoming morally innocent. Assyria can function as an instrument and still stand under judgment itself. Human power can serve purposes it does not understand, and the same army that terrifies one nation may later face its own reckoning. For Isaiah, history is never simple. There are always multiple levels operating at once. A king makes a political decision for political reasons. An army marches because an emperor seeks territory, tribute, and prestige. A city falls because defenses fail. But beneath these visible causes, the prophet evaluates pride, injustice, idolatry, unbelief, and the moral direction of nations. This is why Isaiah's warnings cannot be reduced either to politics or to abstract spirituality. He is speaking about both. The fall of Samaria became an enormous warning to Judah. The northern kingdom had been conquered. Would Judah assume that its own survival proved its righteousness? Isaiah's message refuses that conclusion. Jerusalem has the temple. Judah has the house of David. The southern kingdom has inherited sacred promises. But privilege does not create immunity. The vineyard imagery from Isaiah's earlier preaching still applies. If God looks for justice and finds bloodshed, religious identity alone cannot protect the nation from consequences. And now Judah is more exposed than before. The buffer states to the north have weakened or disappeared. Assyria has moved closer. The empire is swallowing the region. Isaiah begins speaking about Assyria in language that is both terrifying and surprising. In Isaiah 10, Assyria is described as the rod of God's anger. This is one of the most difficult ideas in the prophetic literature. The empire does not know itself as a servant of Judah's God. Its rulers are not invading because they want to fulfill biblical prophecy. They are acting according to imperial ambition. The Assyrian king intends conquest. He wants to destroy. He wants to expand. He compares one conquered city to another. To him, Jerusalem is simply another political target. But Isaiah sees something the emperor does not. Assyria's power has limits. It can be permitted to act without becoming sovereign. The prophet compares the arrogance of the empire to an axe boasting against the person who swings it. Can an axe brag against the one who uses it? Can a saw exalt itself over the hand moving it? The picture is deliberately humiliating. The empire that sees itself as unstoppable is still only an instrument, and an instrument does not control the hand. This becomes one of Isaiah's greatest challenges to political arrogance. Power can produce the illusion of independence. Military success can tempt rulers into believing that history belongs to them. Victory after victory creates its own theology. If every city falls before you, perhaps you begin to think no one stands above you. Isaiah says otherwise. Assyria may enter the story as an agent of judgment, but Assyria will itself be judged for arrogance and violence. The prophet looks at the great imperial machine and sees mortality. Trees will be cut down. The high will be brought low. The forest that appears vast will fall. This pattern echoes one of Isaiah's earliest themes. Human pride cannot remain permanently exalted before the Holy One. The same truth applies to Judah's wealthy elites. It applies to rebellious rulers, and it applies to empires. No one becomes too large to be judged. Yet Isaiah does not use Assyria's future downfall as an excuse for Judah to ignore its own condition. The prophet's sharpest words often remain directed toward the people closest to him. Judah cannot watch Samaria fall and congratulate itself. It must ask whether the same roots of destruction are growing within Jerusalem. Isaiah continues denouncing injustice. He condemns those who create oppressive decrees. He speaks against laws that deprive the poor of justice. Widows become prey. The fatherless are robbed. The prophetic accusation moves from private morality into public systems. This is another reason Isaiah's message would have been uncomfortable. It is easier to condemn obvious pagan practices than to confront injustice embedded in institutions. Isaiah does both. He condemns idols, he condemns pride, he condemns false worship, but he also condemns rulers and officials who use power against those least able to defend themselves. Then comes the question, what will these leaders do in the day of punishment? Where will they run for help? Where will they leave their wealth? That question cuts through the logic of political security. Money may buy influence. Alliances may delay danger. Officials may profit from corruption. But what happens when the system they trusted collapses? Where does power go when a greater power arrives? Judah is being forced to watch the answer unfold in neighboring lands. Meanwhile, the language of the remnant returns. Though Israel had been numerous, only a remnant would return. This is not sentimental optimism. A remnant exists because judgment has been severe. Something has been lost. The nation has been reduced. But reduction is not extinction. Isaiah's theology of the remnant preserves both sides of the message. Sin has real consequences. God's purpose remains. This idea would become central to later biblical reflection. The story does not continue because human beings repeatedly succeed. It continues because judgment does not cancel every promise. That distinction is especially important for the house of David. The kings of Judah are often disappointing. Some are openly rebellious. Others begin well and later fail. Even the better kings cannot permanently solve the spiritual crisis. And yet Isaiah continues to speak about a future connected to David's line. This is not because the present monarchy is strong. It is because hope becomes more significant precisely when the visible institution appears fragile. The image of the stump of Jesse becomes more powerful as the political world deteriorates. A stump is what remains after cutting. A dynasty may look diminished. A kingdom may be surrounded. But Isaiah sees a branch, new growth, a ruler unlike those who govern merely through calculation and fear. The Spirit rests upon him. Righteousness defines him. The poor are not invisible under his rule. Justice is not sold. Power is not separated from wisdom. This coming ruler stands as a rebuke to the failures of current kings. Ahaz had trusted Assyria. The future king Isaiah describes is characterized by a different foundation. He delights in the fear of the Lord. He does not judge by appearances alone. The contrast could not be sharper. One ruler responds to danger by surrendering dependence to an empire. Another is portrayed as ruling in wisdom, righteousness, and faithfulness. Isaiah's prophetic hope is therefore not escapism. It grows directly from political failure. Bad kings make the promise of a righteous king more urgent. Corrupt courts make justice more precious. War makes peace more imaginable. A devastated land makes restoration more meaningful. The darker the historical setting becomes, the more Isaiah develops the language of hope. But hope does not remove the next crisis. Another king now occupies Judah's throne, Hezekiah. The son of Ahaz inherited more than a crown. He inherited a kingdom shaped by his father's compromises. He inherited Assyrian pressure. He inherited religious disorder. He inherited the consequences of decisions made before his reign. Yet the biblical portrait of Hezekiah differs sharply from that of Ahaz. 2 Kings says he trusted in the Lord. 2 Chronicles describes religious reforms. High places associated with improper worship were removed. Sacred pillars were broken. The Asherah was cut down. Even the bronze serpent made by Moses centuries earlier had become an object of improper devotion and was destroyed. The symbolism is striking. Something can have a sacred origin and later be misused. Reform, therefore, requires more than preserving old objects. It requires restoring proper worship. Hezekiah also reopened and reorganized temple worship according to the chronicler's account. Priests and Levites were called to consecration. Passover observance was emphasized. Messengers were sent inviting people, including remnants from the north, to come to Jerusalem. Here again, the remnant theme intersects with actual events. The northern kingdom had fallen, but not every person connected to the tribes of Israel had vanished. Hezekiah's reforms present Jerusalem as a center toward which surviving worshippers could be called. The political kingdom is smaller, but the possibility of renewal remains. For Isaiah, however, reform under a good king does not mean every problem has disappeared. Hezekiah himself will be tested. A king can begin faithfully and still face decisions that expose weakness. The greatest challenge of his reign will force Judah to confront the same issue that dominated Isaiah's encounter with Ahaz. Where will you place your trust? Hezekiah's situation, however, will be far more dangerous, because by then, Assyria will not merely be a distant protector extracting tribute. It will be the enemy. The empire continues its campaigns. Cities fall, rebellions are punished, regional rulers look toward Egypt and other coalitions for relief. The temptation to trust military alliances remains strong. Isaiah repeatedly warns against reliance on Egypt. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, he declares. The problem is not that horses and chariots are imaginary, they are very real. Egypt possesses military resources, but Judah is again in danger of treating visible power as ultimate security. Isaiah's argument is not anti-strategy in the simplistic sense. He is exposing misplaced trust. A nation may make plans, a king may prepare defenses, but when political instruments become substitutes for faithfulness, the deeper problem returns. Isaiah condemns those who rely on horses because they are many, and on horsemen because they are strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel. The contrast is deliberate. What seems strong war horses, chariots, foreign armies, what Isaiah insists is stronger, the one whose throne shook the temple in his calling vision. The issue that began in Isaiah 6 has never really changed. Who is actually sovereign? Everything in Isaiah's ministry comes back to that question. If God is holy and sovereign, then idolatry is absurd. If God is sovereign, Assyria cannot be ultimate. If God is sovereign, political alliances cannot guarantee the future. If God is holy, injustice cannot be ignored. If God is faithful, judgment does not necessarily mean the end of the promise. And if God truly rules, then kings themselves are accountable. Hezekiah will soon need that theology more than any king of Judah has needed it in generations. But before the great siege comes, Isaiah's prophetic gaze sweeps across the surrounding nations. The book of Isaiah contains a series of oracles concerning Babylon, Moab, Damascus, Egypt, Cush, Edom, Arabia, and other peoples or regions. To a modern reader, these chapters can feel like interruptions. Names change quickly. Ancient cities may be unfamiliar. Political situations seem distant. But within Isaiah's world, these prophecies perform an important function. They widen the scale. Judah is not living in a universe where its God cares only about Jerusalem, while the nations operate independently. Isaiah presents the Lord as sovereign over international history. Babylon can rise. Assyria can conquer. Egypt can appear strong. Moab can mourn. Cities can fall. Trade routes can collapse. But no nation exists outside divine judgment. This also means Judah cannot assume that attaching itself to another nation will provide absolute protection. Every potential ally is temporary. Every empire has an expiration date. The prophet even speaks against Babylon long before Babylon becomes the final destroyer of Jerusalem. This forward reach can surprise readers who associate Isaiah's political world mainly with Assyria. But Babylon already existed as an important Mesopotamian center and would eventually become far more significant in Judah's history. Isaiah's book moves across horizons. The immediate enemy may be Assyria. The future crisis may involve Babylon. The ultimate hope reaches beyond both. This layered movement is one reason the book can feel enormous. Isaiah is not telling one short political story. He is tracing a pattern of pride, judgment, remnant, and restoration across changing historical powers. Yet the human cost of these events must not be forgotten. When prophets say cities will fall, actual families live inside those cities. When empires deport populations, people lose homes. When alliances collapse, soldiers die. When fields are ruined, ordinary households go hungry. Biblical prophecy is sometimes so familiar that its language can lose emotional weight. But Isaiah lived near the consequences. The smoke over a conquered region was not an abstract symbol. Refugees were not theological concepts. Political fear entered homes. Parents wondered what would happen to children. Kings calculated whether tribute could prevent invasion. Farmers planted while not knowing whether an army might take the harvest. Priests continued worship while rumors of conquest spread. Isaiah's message emerges from that world. This makes his hope more remarkable, not less. He speaks about peace in an age of war. He speaks about a righteous king in an age of political compromise. He speaks about a remnant while populations are being deported. He speaks about light while describing darkness. His optimism is not based on favorable conditions. It is based on the character and purpose of God. But there is a danger in hearing only the hopeful parts. Isaiah's future promises do not cancel his present warnings. A nation cannot claim the coming kingdom while rejecting justice now. A ruler cannot celebrate Davidic promises while refusing trust. A worshiper cannot admire temple beauty while ignoring the holiness Isaiah saw there. Hope is not permission for complacency. It is a call to faithfulness. As Hezekiah's reign develops, the kingdom begins to face another decision. Assyrian control is oppressive. Resistance becomes attractive. Regional politics become unstable, and at some point Hezekiah rebels against the king of Assyria. 2 Kings notes that he refused to continue serving him. Politically, this is an enormous gamble. Assyria does not tolerate rebellion lightly. The empire has built its reputation partly by making examples of cities that refuse submission. The likely response is predictable, an invasion, and that invasion comes. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, marches against Judah. The year is traditionally associated with his campaign of 701 BC. One of the best-known points of contact between the biblical record and surviving Assyrian royal inscriptions. The Assyrian campaign sweeps into Judah. Fortified cities are attacked. The countryside is devastated. Hezekiah feels the pressure and initially attempts to resolve the crisis through tribute. 2 Kings records his admission to the Assyrian king that he has done wrong by rebelling and asks for the invading force to withdraw in exchange for whatever payment is imposed. The amount demanded is enormous. To meet it, Hezekiah gives silver from the temple and palace treasuries. He even strips gold from the doors and doorposts of the temple that he himself had covered. Think of the reversal. A king remembered for restoring worship now removes precious metal from the temple to satisfy an empire. Fear has a way of forcing contradictions. Even a faithful ruler can become desperate. The payment does not ultimately end the crisis. Assyria has come too far. The empire is not merely asking whether Judah will pay, it is demonstrating dominance. One fortified city after another falls. Among them is Lachish, one of Judah's most important defensive centers southwest of Jerusalem. Lachish was not a minor village. It was strategically significant. If Lachish fell, Jerusalem's situation became far more dangerous. Assyrian sources proudly commemorate the conquest. The empire wants the world to know that resistance has consequences. From Lachish, Assyrian forces turn their attention toward Jerusalem. And now the crisis becomes personal, not merely for Hezekiah, for Isaiah, for the priests, for the officials, for every family within the walls. The empire Isaiah had warned about for years is no longer approaching someone else. Its representatives are outside Jerusalem. The Assyrian delegation arrives near the same general water system setting where Isaiah had once confronted Ahaz. The irony is difficult to miss. Years earlier, Ahaz had stood near Jerusalem's water supply, while Isaiah warned him not to solve his fear by trusting Assyria. Now Assyria itself stands near Jerusalem. The choice of one generation has helped shape the crisis of another. History remembers decisions. Sometimes children inherit problems created by their fathers. The Assyrian spokesman, commonly called the Rabshakeh in English translations, does not begin with swords. He begins with words, psychological warfare. He speaks to Hezekiah's officials, and his central question sounds almost like a dark parody of Isaiah's preaching. What is this confidence in which you trust? The entire conflict suddenly becomes a battle over trust. Isaiah has spent years asking Judah what it trusts. Now Assyria asks the same question mockingly. Do you trust Egypt? The Rabshakeh ridicules that possibility. Egypt, he says in effect, is like a broken reed that injures anyone who leans upon it. On this point, his critique sounds disturbingly close to Isaiah's own warnings. Isaiah also said Egypt could not provide ultimate security. But the Assyrian spokesman continues, perhaps Judah will say it trusts the Lord. He attacks that confidence too. Hezekiah has removed high places and altars, the spokesman claims, apparently misunderstanding or deliberately misrepresenting Hezekiah's religious reforms. From the Assyrian perspective, reducing local shrines may look like weakening divine support. The theological difference is enormous. Hezekiah did not remove legitimate worship of the Lord in order to oppose him. According to the biblical account, he centralized and purified worship. But Assyria does not understand Judah's covenant theology, or perhaps it does not care. The goal is intimidation. Then comes ridicule. The spokesman challenges Judah to accept horses if it can even provide enough trained riders. He mocks its military capacity. He claims Assyria has divine authorization for the campaign. And then Hezekiah's officials make a request. Speak in Aramaic, they say. Do not speak in the language of Judah, where the people on the wall can understand. The Rabshakeh refuses. He wants the population to hear. This is psychological warfare directed at civilians. His voice rises toward those standing on Jerusalem's walls. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you. Do not let him persuade you to trust the Lord. Make peace with Assyria. Surrender. Enjoy your own vines and fig trees until you are relocated to another land. The language of deportation is presented as comfort. Submission is marketed as survival. Then the spokesman makes his most dangerous argument. Have the gods of any other nations delivered them from the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath? Where are the gods of Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Who among all the gods of these countries has delivered his land from Assyria? Why should Jerusalem be different? From the perspective of imperial experience, the argument is powerful. Assyria has conquered nations. Those nations had gods. Their cities fell anyway. Therefore, Jerusalem's God will fail as well. Military success becomes theological proof. The empire has confused victory with supremacy. And this is where the conflict reaches directly back to Isaiah's calling. Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up. Assyria sees Jerusalem as one more city on a list. Isaiah heard seraphim declare that the whole earth is full of God's glory. Assyria believes the earth belongs to whichever army can conquer it. Isaiah knows Assyria is an axe. Assyria thinks it is the hand. Those two visions of reality are about to collide. The people on Jerusalem's wall remain silent. Hezekiah had ordered them not to answer. The Assyrian words hang over the city. Officials return to the king with torn clothes. Hezekiah hears the report. He tears his own clothes. He covers himself with sackcloth. And then, unlike Ahaz before him, he does something decisive. He goes into the house of the Lord. He also sends messengers to Isaiah. The king, who inherited the consequences of his father's fear, now turns toward the prophet his father once resisted. The message delivered to Isaiah describes the day as one of distress, rebuke, and disgrace. Judah has reached a point of helplessness. The imagery is of a child ready to be born when there is no strength to deliver. The kingdom has prepared, it has fortified, it has paid tribute, it has made political decisions, but now those solutions have reached their limit. There are moments when every illusion of self-sufficiency collapses at once. Jerusalem is approaching such a moment. Outside the walls stands the greatest military power of the age. Inside the city stands a king in sackcloth, and between them stands the old prophetic question, whom will Judah trust? Isaiah sends back an answer. Do not be afraid because of the words you have heard. The Assyrian officials have blasphemed. The threat is real, but their conclusion is false. The empire has reached Jerusalem. It has not reached a throne, Isaiah saw. And for the first time since the shadow of Assyria began stretching across Judah, the conflict is approaching a decisive confrontation. Samaria has already fallen. Lachish has been attacked. Judah's fortified cities have been devastated. Jerusalem appears trapped. There is no larger army coming to rescue it. No political strategy has guaranteed its safety. No tribute has ended the threat. Assyria has reduced the question to its most brutal form. Will Jerusalem fall like every city before it? The answer will become one of the defining events of Isaiah's life. But before deliverance can come, the king of Assyria will send one more message, and this time, Hezekiah will carry the threat directly into the temple. Hezekiah carried the Assyrian threat into the house of the Lord. The letter was not symbolic. It represented a real empire, a real army, and a real danger. Outside Jerusalem stood forces that had already destroyed cities Judah once considered secure. The northern kingdom had fallen. Lachish had been attacked. Assyria had demonstrated repeatedly that resistance could end in siege, humiliation, deportation, and death. Inside Jerusalem, Hezekiah had very little left to rely upon. And this is precisely what made the moment different from the reign of his father. Ahaz had faced fear and reached outward toward Assyria. Hezekiah faced Assyria and brought the threat before God. 2 Kings and Isaiah describe the king going up to the temple, spreading the letter before the Lord, and praying. The scene is one of the most important moments in Isaiah's story because it reveals what the prophet had been teaching for years. Faith does not mean refusing to look at the threat. Hezekiah reads the letter. He knows what Assyria has done. He does not pretend the empire is weak. He does not claim Jerusalem has a stronger army. He acknowledges that Assyrian kings have devastated nations and thrown their gods into the fire. Those gods were destroyed, he says, because they were not truly gods at all, but objects made by human hands. Then Hezekiah asks for deliverance, not merely so that his throne will survive, not merely so that Jerusalem will avoid destruction. He asks that the kingdoms of the earth may know that the Lord alone is God. The crisis has become theological. Assyria's challenge was never simply, can Jerusalem defend itself? Its deeper claim was, why should Jerusalem's God be different from the gods of all the cities we have already conquered? Hezekiah's prayer directly answers that arrogance. The God of Judah is not one regional deity competing against other regional deities. Isaiah's entire ministry has pointed toward this truth. The Lord is the Holy One. The whole earth is filled with His glory. Kings and empires exist beneath His authority. Assyria has mistaken military success for ultimate sovereignty, and now Isaiah sends word to Hezekiah. The king's prayer has been heard. What follows is not a brief reassurance. It is a prophetic response to the king of Assyria himself. Isaiah portrays Zion as mocking the invader who has treated Jerusalem with contempt. The empire has raised its voice. It has lifted its eyes arrogantly, but Isaiah asks a devastating question. Whom have you mocked and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice? The answer is, the Holy One of Israel. Assyria boasts that by the strength of its chariots it has climbed mountains, cut down great trees, dug wells, and dried up waters. The language reflects imperial pride. The king attributes his victories to his own power. But Isaiah overturns the entire interpretation. Had Assyria not heard that these events existed within a purpose larger than itself? The empire is powerful, but it is not independent. It has accomplished astonishing things, but it has not escaped divine sovereignty. Then Isaiah uses another unforgettable image. Because of Assyria's arrogance, the Lord will put a hook in its nose and a bit in its mouth and turn it back by the way it came. For an empire known for humiliating conquered peoples, the reversal is deliberate. The conqueror will itself be restrained. The one who led others away will be turned back. The one who boasted that no city could resist will discover that its power has a boundary. Isaiah gives Hezekiah a sign. The land has been devastated by invasion. Normal agriculture has been interrupted. For a time, the people will eat what grows of itself, then what springs from that. But eventually, they will sow and reap again. Vineyards will be planted. Fruit will return. The surviving remnant of Judah will take root downward and bear fruit upward. The language is agricultural, but the meaning reaches beyond farming. Assyria has cut deeply into Judah. Cities have fallen, fields have been damaged, population and wealth have been lost. Yet the kingdom will not disappear in this crisis. A remnant will survive. Once again, Isaiah's central theme returns. The tree may be cut, but not every root is dead. The empire may devastate, but it cannot erase the promise. Then comes the direct prediction concerning Jerusalem. The king of Assyria will not enter the city. He will not shoot an arrow there. He will not come before it with shield in hand. He will not build the siege ramp necessary to take it. He will return by the route he came. For Jerusalem, this is extraordinary. Military logic points in the opposite direction. Assyria has conquered stronger positions. Judah has already lost major fortified cities. The capital is vulnerable. Yet Isaiah declares that the city will be defended. The reason is connected both to God's own name and to the promise associated with David. The story now reaches one of its most dramatic biblical moments. According to the account in Kings and Isaiah, the angel of the Lord strikes the Assyrian camp, and a vast number of troops die. By morning, the threat has changed completely. Sennacherib withdraws. He returns to Nineveh. Jerusalem survives. The Bible presents the deliverance as an act of God. For Judah, the result is unmistakable. The empire that had spoken as though Jerusalem were merely the next city on its conquest list does not take the capital. Isaiah's message has been vindicated. But to understand what this means, we must also understand what it does not mean. It does not mean Judah suffered no devastation. Many cities had already fallen. The countryside had endured severe damage. Families had experienced the consequences of invasion. Assyria had demonstrated overwhelming power throughout the kingdom. Jerusalem's survival did not erase those losses. Nor does the deliverance mean Judah had suddenly become morally perfect. Isaiah's earlier accusations remain. Injustice still matters. Pride still matters. False worship still matters. Political fear still matters. The city has been spared, but being spared is not the same as being transformed. That distinction becomes crucial in the rest of Isaiah's story. A miraculous deliverance can become a source of humility. It can also become a source of dangerous confidence. If Jerusalem survived Assyria, some might begin to assume that Jerusalem could never fall. That conclusion would be fatal, because Isaiah never teaches that the city is untouchable regardless of its faithfulness. He teaches that God is sovereign. Those are not the same thing. Jerusalem is not sovereign. The temple is not a magical shield. The Davidic throne is not permission for rebellion. The survival of the city under Sennacherib is an act of deliverance, not a guarantee that future generations can ignore every warning. This testing will eventually become one of the great themes of Judah's later history. But Isaiah's own story is not finished with Hezekiah. The Assyrian crisis has shown one side of the king, a ruler under pressure, a ruler who prays, a ruler who listens to the prophet, a ruler whose city is delivered. Now another crisis will reveal a more personal weakness. Hezekiah becomes gravely ill. Isaiah comes to him with a message that could hardly be more severe. Set your house in order. You are going to die. For a king, death is never only private. Who will succeed him? What happens to the dynasty? What happens to reforms he has begun? What happens to Judah in a world still dominated by great powers? But before political questions come personal grief. Hezekiah turns his face toward the wall and prays. He remembers his faithfulness. He weeps bitterly. The biblical account is brief, but the emotional weight is clear. This is not the king standing before an army. This is a man facing his own mortality. The Assyrians could retreat. Death cannot be bribed. Fortifications cannot stop it. Foreign allies cannot negotiate with it. Then, before Isaiah has gone far, another word comes. The prophet is told to return. Hezekiah's prayer has been heard. His tears have been seen. His life will be extended by 15 years. The city will also continue to be defended from Assyria. A treatment involving a fig poultice is applied to the diseased area, and Hezekiah is given a sign associated with the shadow moving backward. The precise physical mechanism is not explained by the text. The point of the narrative is the sign itself and the assurance given to the king. Once again, Isaiah stands at the intersection of prophecy, royal crisis, and divine mercy. A death sentence is followed by reprieve. A king who expected his life to end receives additional years. This could have become the perfect ending to Hezekiah's story. Jerusalem delivered, the king healed, the dynasty preserved, the prophet vindicated. But Scripture rarely allows its heroes to remain frozen at their strongest moment. The same king who trusted during crisis will soon display another weakness. And this time, the danger will not arrive with an army. It will arrive with gifts. Envoys come from Babylon. At this stage, Babylon has not yet become the empire that will eventually destroy Jerusalem. Assyria is still the dominant regional power. But Babylon is politically significant. Its rulers have their own ambitions and their own conflicts with Assyria. According to the biblical account, the Babylonian king hears of Hezekiah's illness and recovery and sends letters and a gift. Diplomatic interest can wear the appearance of friendship. Hezekiah welcomes the envoys. And then he does something the biblical narrative treats with concern. He shows them everything. His treasury, silver, gold, spices, precious oil, the armory, everything found among his treasures. Nothing in his palace or kingdom is kept from their view. Why does Hezekiah do this? The text does not provide a long psychological explanation. It would be easy to invent one. Perhaps he wanted to impress them. Perhaps he saw Babylon as a useful political partner. Perhaps pride after recovery played a role. 2 Chronicles explicitly connects the episode to pride and to a test of what was in Hezekiah's heart. But we should not create details the text does not give. What the narrative makes clear is that the display becomes the occasion for one of Isaiah's most consequential prophecies. The prophet comes to Hezekiah. What did these men say? Where did they come from? The king answers, they came from a distant country, Babylon. Then Isaiah asks what they saw in the palace. Hezekiah's response is complete. They saw everything. Nothing among his treasures was hidden from them. At this point, Isaiah's message turns the direction of the story. The prophet tells Hezekiah that days are coming when everything in his palace, everything his ancestors have stored up, will be carried away to Babylon. Nothing will remain. Even descendants from the royal line will be taken away and serve in the palace of the Babylonian king. For Isaiah's audience, this is an extraordinary shift. The great enemy of the present is Assyria. Jerusalem has just survived Assyria. Yet Isaiah points toward Babylon. The crisis that destroyed the northern kingdom did not destroy Judah. The siege that seemed likely to end Jerusalem has passed. But preservation from one judgment does not mean the entire story of judgment has been canceled. Another horizon has opened. Babylon. The name will eventually become inseparable from Judah's greatest national catastrophe. Jerusalem will fall. The temple will burn. The Davidic king will lose control of the city. Treasures will be carried away. People will be exiled. But in Hezekiah's day, much of that still lies in the future. This is one of the most important transitions in the book of Isaiah. The narrative begins under the shadow of Assyria. It now looks toward Babylon. And once Babylon enters the prophetic horizon, Isaiah's message of comfort and restoration will take on even greater significance. Because if exile is coming, a new question emerges. Can a people survive judgment on that scale? Can the covenant story continue if Jerusalem itself falls? Can the descendants of Judah have hope when they are far from their land? Can the house of David still matter when a king no longer rules independently from Jerusalem? Can the promise survive national collapse? Isaiah's later prophecies will answer those questions with some of the most powerful language in all of Scripture. But first we must remain with Hezekiah. His response to Isaiah's warning is complicated. He acknowledges the word as good, and the biblical text indicates that he thinks there will at least be peace and security during his own lifetime. Readers have interpreted this reaction in different ways. It may express humble acceptance of judgment. It may also reveal relief that the disaster will not occur immediately. The text allows the uneasiness to remain. A king has been told that future generations will inherit consequences, and his response does not undo them. This is a sobering contrast with his earlier prayer. When Assyria threatens his own Jerusalem, Hezekiah pleads passionately. When Babylon is described as a danger for a later generation, the urgency is different. Human beings often feel the crisis nearest to themselves most intensely. Isaiah's prophetic vision is larger. He must think in generations. The prophet who confronted Ahaz had watched a father's decision shape his son's world. Now he sees how Hezekiah's kingdom stands within a story that will continue long after Hezekiah dies. This generational perspective matters deeply in Isaiah. Sin can move through generations. So can consequences. But promises can also move through generations. A king dies, the house continues. A city falls, a remnant survives. A tree is cut, a shoot appears. The prophet himself will one day disappear. His words will remain. Isaiah's ministry increasingly becomes a struggle to help Judah see beyond the immediate moment. The people naturally ask, will Assyria invade? Isaiah answers that question, but he also asks what kind of people they are becoming. The king asks, will Jerusalem survive? Isaiah addresses that, but he also looks toward Babylon. The nation wants security now. Isaiah speaks about judgment, remnant, restoration, and a future king. His vision repeatedly extends beyond the lifetime of the people hearing him. This is one reason Isaiah's book has such unusual depth. The prophet lives in one century, but speaks in language that later generations will hear as though it were addressed directly to them. The Assyrian crisis is historical. The Babylonian exile is anticipated. The restoration is proclaimed, and beyond restoration, the prophetic horizon continues opening. But before the book moves more fully into comfort, Isaiah continues confronting the illusion that Jerusalem's survival has solved Judah's spiritual problem. In Isaiah 22, the prophet describes Jerusalem during crisis with imagery that is both vivid and disturbing. Instead of mourning and repentance, there is feasting. Cattle are slaughtered, wine is consumed. The attitude becomes, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." This response reveals fatalism rather than faith. If destruction is possible, enjoy the present. If judgment is coming, surrender to appetite. Isaiah condemns this reaction, because despair can be just as spiritually dangerous as false confidence. One person says, "Nothing bad can happen to us." Another says, "Everything will end anyway, so nothing matters." Isaiah rejects both. The first ignores judgment, the second abandons responsibility. Faith stands somewhere else. It takes warning seriously while still believing obedience matters. The prophet also speaks against officials who use power for self-exaltation. One example is Shebna, a royal official who appears to have held significant authority. Isaiah rebukes him for preparing an impressive tomb for himself and announces his removal from office. Another official, Eliakim, is raised into responsibility. The details may appear small beside international war, but they reveal a consistent principle. Isaiah is concerned not only with kings and empires, he is concerned with how authority is used at every level. No official is too minor for accountability. No empire is too large for accountability. No priestly ritual is too sacred to be questioned when injustice surrounds it. No king is too faithful to be beyond correction. Isaiah's theology is comprehensive because holiness is comprehensive. This is also why his message could be so exhausting to hear. There is nowhere comfortable to hide. The rich cannot hide behind wealth. The poor cannot assume suffering automatically produces righteousness. Kings cannot hide behind office. Priests cannot hide behind ritual. Jerusalem cannot hide behind the temple. Judah cannot hide behind Davidic ancestry. Assyria cannot hide behind victory. Babylon will not be exempt when its own time comes. Everything is measured against the holiness Isaiah saw. And yet judgment is never Isaiah's only horizon. Even while speaking against nations, he repeatedly surprises his audience with visions of inclusion and restoration. One of the most remarkable appears in Isaiah 19. Egypt, the ancient land associated with Israel's slavery, and Assyria, the brutal empire threatening Isaiah's own generation, appear in a future vision alongside Israel. The prophet imagines a highway connecting former enemies. Egypt and Assyria are pictured participating in worship. Israel stands with them in blessing. The language is astonishing because these are not sentimental neighbors. They represent powers deeply associated with oppression and threat. Yet Isaiah's final vision for the nations is larger than destruction. The purpose of God reaches beyond Judah. The same prophet who announces judgment on nations can imagine nations transformed. This is essential for understanding his theology. Isaiah is not simply pro-Judah and anti-everyone else. Judah itself is judged. Foreign nations are judged. But foreign nations can also be included in future blessing. The holiness of God threatens human pride everywhere. The mercy of God also reaches beyond boundaries Judah may consider permanent. This vision prepares the way for themes that will later become extremely important in the New Testament. But Isaiah's immediate audience still has a difficult road ahead. Assyria has not disappeared simply because Jerusalem survived one campaign. Political instability remains. the next generations will not automatically preserve Hezekiah's reforms. And the king who follows Hezekiah will be very different, Manasseh. His reign will later be remembered in Kings as one of the darkest periods in Judah's history. He will reverse many reforms. Idolatrous practices will return. Foreign worship will penetrate deeply into national life. Innocent blood will be shed. Later tradition will connect Isaiah's death with this king, though the Bible itself does not directly tell us how Isaiah died. That distinction must remain clear. For now, Isaiah is still alive within the biblical narrative. His ministry has survived Ahaz. It has survived the fall of Samaria. It has survived Assyria's invasion. It has witnessed Hezekiah's prayer, Jerusalem's deliverance, the king's illness, his recovery, and the appearance of Babylonian envoys. But something fundamental has changed. At the beginning of Isaiah's ministry, the great question was whether Judah could survive enemies like Aram, Israel, and Assyria. Now Isaiah has revealed that survival itself is not the final goal. Jerusalem can survive an army and still face judgment later. A king can be healed and still make mistakes. A generation can be spared while another inherits consequences. The deepest crisis is not whether one invasion succeeds, it is whether Judah will ever become the people its covenant calling requires. The answer cannot come merely from another military victory. It cannot come from another temporary reform. It cannot come from another political alliance. The prophetic horizon must become larger. A deeper restoration is needed. Isaiah begins to speak as though he is standing not only in Jerusalem before exile, but beside future generations who will experience its consequences. His voice changes. The warnings remain behind him. The memory of judgment remains. But suddenly, the language becomes tender. Comfort, comfort my people. The prophet who had announced cities becoming desolate now speaks to people who will need to believe that desolation is not the end. A highway will be prepared. The glory of the Lord will be revealed. Those who believe their way has been forgotten will be reminded that the Creator does not grow weary. A servant will appear. A new exodus will be imagined. A remnant will become a restored people. And the question that once centered on Assyria will become much larger. If Judah loses everything it thinks proves God is with it, can God still bring his people home? The darkest midpoint of Isaiah's message has arrived. Judgment is no longer merely a warning. Babylon now stands on the horizon. But precisely here, where national confidence begins to fail, Isaiah's greatest language of hope is about to begin. Comfort, comfort my people. The tone changes almost immediately. After chapters filled with warnings, political collapse, Assyrian aggression, failed trust, royal weakness, and the looming shadow of Babylon, Isaiah begins to speak to a generation that will need something more than another warning. They will need hope. Not shallow optimism, not denial, not the promise that consequences can simply be ignored. They will need a reason to believe that judgment is not the final word. Isaiah 40 opens as though the prophet is standing beside people who have already experienced disaster. Jerusalem has suffered. The old confidence has been shattered. Exile has become part of the horizon. The people are no longer asking whether foreign invasion is possible. They are asking something deeper. Has God forgotten us? Has the covenant failed? Are the promises finished? Isaiah answers with language of comfort. A voice cries out to prepare the way of the Lord. A highway is imagined through the wilderness. Valleys are lifted, mountains are brought low. The glory of the Lord will be revealed. The imagery deliberately recalls Israel's earlier history. Once before, a people had been trapped under foreign power. Once before, a path had opened through what seemed impossible. Once before, God had led his people out. Isaiah begins to describe restoration using the language of a new exodus. But this time, the geography is different. The people are not coming out of Egypt. The future concern is Babylon, and the wilderness road points toward return. This pattern becomes crucial to Isaiah's message. The past teaches the people how to understand the future. God's earlier acts are not merely memories. They become categories of hope. The God who made a way once is not exhausted. The God who created the heavens has not lost control because Judah has failed. Isaiah asks the people to look upward. Who created the stars? Who brings them out one by one? Who calls them all by name? Not one is missing. Then comes the complaint Isaiah anticipates from the suffering community. My way is hidden. My cause is disregarded. In other words, God does not see what has happened to us. God has forgotten us. The prophet answers by returning to creation. The Lord is the everlasting God. The Creator does not grow tired. Human beings become exhausted. Young men stumble. Strong people fail. But those who wait upon the Lord renew their strength. The famous image of mounting up with wings like eagles is not spoken to people enjoying easy lives. It is spoken into exhaustion. Hope becomes meaningful because weakness is real. Isaiah is not promising that faithful people never grow tired. He is declaring that human limitation does not equal divine limitation. That distinction matters profoundly for exiles. A fallen city can make God appear defeated. A destroyed temple can make divine presence seem absent. A conquered monarchy can make the promise to David appear broken. Isaiah counters those conclusions by enlarging the scale. Babylon is not larger than the Creator. The nations are not equal to him. Human rulers come and go. God does not. The same logic that once reduced Assyria from an unstoppable empire to an axe in another hand now applies to every future power. No empire becomes ultimate because it temporarily controls Jerusalem. This is where Isaiah introduces a historical figure who would have sounded astonishing to later generations: Cyrus, a ruler associated with Persia. Isaiah 44 and 45 names Cyrus in connection with the return and rebuilding process. Within the prophetic vision, God can use a foreign ruler to accomplish purposes that ruler may not fully understand. The pattern resembles the earlier theology of Assyria, but with a very different outcome. Assyria had functioned as an instrument of judgment. Cyrus is associated with release. The point is not that foreign rulers become spiritually ideal. The point is that the Lord is not restricted to working only through Israelite kings. He can move history through unexpected people. The exile will not end because Judah suddenly becomes militarily superior. Return will become possible because the geopolitical order changes. Empires rise, empires fall. Another ruler emerges. And the people who believed Babylon had the final word discover that Babylon itself is temporary. Isaiah mocks idols in this section with sharp irony. A craftsman takes wood. Part of it becomes fuel for cooking and warmth. Another part becomes an idol. Then the person bows before what his own hands produced. The satire is deliberate. The same piece of material becomes both firewood and an object of worship. How can something created by human hands control history? This contrast matters, especially in exile. A conquered people might be tempted to assume that Babylon's gods were stronger because Babylon had won. Ancient warfare often carried theological implications. Victory could be interpreted as evidence that one nation's gods had defeated another's. Isaiah rejects that entire framework. The God of Israel is not a statue that can be carried away when a city falls. He is not confined to Jerusalem. He is not defeated by Babylonian armies. He is the Creator. The nations themselves exist within His world. Therefore, exile can be real without implying divine defeat. This is one of the great theological achievements of Isaiah. The destruction of national institutions does not destroy the identity of God, and therefore the loss of those institutions does not have to destroy hope. Isaiah repeatedly calls Israel God's servant. This language becomes increasingly important. Sometimes servant clearly refers to Israel as a people. Israel has been chosen for a purpose. Israel is meant to witness. Israel is meant to know the Lord and make His character known. But there is a problem. The servant is often blind. The servant is often deaf. The people called to witness do not always understand. The people meant to embody faithfulness repeatedly fail. That tension opens one of the most important developments in the entire book. If Israel is the servant, but Israel itself needs restoration, how will the servant fulfill the mission? Isaiah begins to speak about a servant whose profile becomes increasingly distinct. In Isaiah 42, the servant is introduced quietly. He does not shout in the streets. He does not crush a bruised reed. He does not extinguish a faintly burning wick. He is associated with justice. He becomes a light to the nations. He opens blind eyes. He brings prisoners out of darkness. This servant does not look like Assyria. He does not establish purpose through terror. He does not look like the corrupt officials Isaiah condemned. He does not exploit weakness. His power is expressed through faithfulness. Already the scope has moved beyond Judah alone. The nations are involved. The servant's mission reaches outward. The same Isaiah, who once watched imperial armies cross borders, now imagines a mission crossing borders for another reason. Not conquest, light. This theme grows in Isaiah 49. The servant is called from the womb. His mouth is compared to a sharp sword. He appears to labor without visible success. And yet his mission expands. It is too small, the prophecy says, in effect, merely to restore the tribes of Jacob. The servant will also become a light to the nations, so that salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. That statement is one of the clearest signs that Isaiah's hope has become global. Judah's restoration is not the entire purpose. Israel's story has implications beyond Israel. The nations who once appeared primarily as threats in the earlier chapters now appear as potential recipients of light. Judgment remains real, but the final horizon is not endless hostility between peoples. Isaiah is imagining something larger: a restored people, a faithful servant, nations drawn toward divine light, and a new act of redemption that resembles the Exodus while surpassing it. The prophet repeatedly tells the people not to remember former things in a way that traps them in the past. This does not mean forget the Exodus. Isaiah himself constantly uses its imagery. The point is that God is doing a new thing. A way appears in the wilderness. Rivers flow in the desert. The old act of deliverance becomes a pattern, but not a limit. God is not required to repeat history in exactly the same form. The new Exodus will not necessarily look like Moses standing before Pharaoh. History changes. The faithfulness behind history does not. This gives the people another kind of hope. They do not have to recreate the past perfectly in order for restoration to occur. They have to recognize that the God of the past remains active in the present. But comfort does not eliminate responsibility. Isaiah calls Israel away from fear. He calls them to remember who they are. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. The language is intimate. When you pass through waters, I will be with you. When you walk through fire, you will not be consumed. Again, Isaiah does not say there will be no waters. He does not say there will be no fire. Divine presence is not presented as exemption from difficulty. It is presence within difficulty. That truth reaches back to Immanuel, God with us. Ahaz had heard the sign in political crisis and refused the path of trust. Now the same theological reality becomes comfort for a people passing through judgment. The meaning deepens across the book. God with his people does not mean every king succeeds. It does not mean Jerusalem never suffers. It means the covenant story cannot be reduced to the stability of one generation. Isaiah's vision of return becomes increasingly vivid. Zion is portrayed as a woman who believes she has been forgotten. The Lord answers with maternal imagery. Can a mother forget the child she nurses? Even if such a thing were possible, God says, He will not forget Zion. Her walls are pictured as continually before Him. The people who saw ruined stones are told that abandonment is not permanent. Another image portrays Jerusalem as a barren woman who will one day have more children than expected. The tent must be enlarged, cords must be lengthened, space must be prepared. Restoration will exceed the imagination formed by loss. These images are intentionally emotional. Isaiah is no longer only arguing intellectually that God remains sovereign. He is addressing the wound of abandonment. Exile changes more than geography. It changes identity. A people removed from its land can begin asking whether it still belongs anywhere. A dynasty without a functioning throne can begin asking whether its promises still matter. A city reduced to memory can become a symbol of failure. Isaiah answers with restoration imagery powerful enough to rebuild imagination before walls are rebuilt. This is why prophetic hope often precedes historical change. Before people can return, they must believe return is conceivable. Before restoration happens politically, it has to become imaginable spiritually. Isaiah gives them language for that imagination. But then, the servant theme moves into darker territory. Isaiah 50 presents a servant who listens and obeys, but suffers opposition. His back is given to those who strike. His face is not hidden from disgrace. The faithful servant is not immediately celebrated. Obedience brings suffering. This introduces a difficult idea. The servant does not merely rescue sufferers. The servant suffers. That theme reaches its most famous expression in Isaiah 52 and 53. But before that great passage, Isaiah continues widening the vision of salvation. He announces good news to Zion. The messenger comes over the mountains. Peace is proclaimed. Good news is announced. Salvation is declared. Your God reigns. That sentence responds to the entire crisis of exile. Who reigns when Babylon appears to reign? Who reigns when Jerusalem has fallen? Who reigns when a foreign emperor controls the political future? Isaiah's answer is not based on what the map looks like. Your God reigns. The watchmen see restoration approaching. The ruins of Jerusalem are told to break into singing. The Lord has comforted His people. The ends of the earth will see His salvation. Again the horizon expands. Jerusalem matters. Israel matters. But the final revelation reaches outward. Then comes the passage that would become one of the most discussed texts in the entire Bible. The servant is exalted. But before exaltation comes disfigurement. Before honor comes rejection. Before vindication comes suffering. Isaiah 53 describes the servant as lacking the kind of outward appearance that would naturally attract admiration. He is despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. People turn away from him. At first, observers interpret his suffering in one way. They assume he is struck down under divine judgment. Then their understanding changes. He was wounded for our transgressions. The suffering is interpreted as having a representative dimension. The servant bears griefs, carries sorrows. He is associated with the wrongdoing of others. The imagery includes sheep going astray and iniquity laid upon the servant. He is oppressed. He does not respond with retaliatory violence. He is compared to a lamb led to slaughter. He is cut off from the land of the living. He is assigned a grave, yet death does not become the final movement. The servant is vindicated. He sees the outcome of his suffering. He bears the sins of many. He intercedes for transgressors. Within Isaiah itself, this passage must first be read as part of the servant theme that has been developing across the book. The relationship between the servant and Israel is complex. At points, Israel is explicitly called the servant. At other points, the servant appears to have a mission toward Israel, suggesting a representative or distinct figure. The text creates this tension rather than resolving it through a simple label. Christian readers from the earliest New Testament period saw Isaiah 53 as profoundly connected to Jesus' suffering and death. The New Testament repeatedly draws upon this passage. Acts records Philip explaining the text to the Ethiopian official in relation to Jesus. 1 Peter uses servant imagery to interpret Christ's suffering. The Gospels echo themes of rejection, bearing sin, and silent suffering. But the later Christian application should not cause us to skip Isaiah's own literary development. The servant emerges from the crisis of failed Israel. Israel is called to serve but repeatedly fails. A faithful servant appears whose mission restores Israel and extends to the nations. His faithfulness includes suffering. His suffering becomes redemptive for others. His vindication follows humiliation. This sequence becomes one of the deepest theological currents in Isaiah. Power is redefined. Victory no longer looks only like an army defeating another army. The servant conquers differently, through obedience, through suffering, through faithfulness, through bearing what belongs to others. For an audience accustomed to Assyrian propaganda, this would be a radical contrast. Assyria proves power by making others suffer. The servant reveals a different kind of power by suffering for others. One empire humiliates captives to display greatness. The servant is humiliated and yet becomes exalted. The world's logic is reversed. This reversal continues in Isaiah 54. Immediately after the servant's suffering, Zion is told to sing. The barren woman becomes fruitful. The disgraced city is restored. The covenant of peace is emphasized. The language suggests that the servant's work and Zion's restoration belong within the same movement. Then Isaiah 55 issues an invitation. Come to the waters. Come without money. Receive what truly satisfies. Listen and live. The covenant promises associated with David are recalled, and the invitation again reaches toward nations. People previously unknown will come. The word of God is compared to rain and snow that accomplish their purpose before returning. It does not go out empty. This image is especially powerful in the context of Isaiah's own ministry. Remember his calling. He had been told he would speak to people who would often refuse to hear. From a human perspective, much of his work could look ineffective. Warnings were ignored. Ahaz refused. Judah continued failing. Future exile still stood ahead. But Isaiah 55 insists that the divine word is not ultimately empty. Its purpose may unfold across generations. A prophet may die before the full effect of his message becomes visible. The word remains. This idea points toward Isaiah's own legacy. He will not live to see every horizon contained in his book. He will not personally witness the later return from Babylon. He will not witness the New Testament writers quoting him centuries later. He will not hear communities across the world reading his words. Yet his ministry is already built around the conviction that fulfillment is not limited to the prophet's lifetime. The messenger can disappear. The word continues. Isaiah then moves into questions of community. What kind of people should restored Israel become if exile ends but injustice simply returns? Has restoration truly reached its goal? Isaiah 56 opens the door wider. Foreigners who join themselves to the Lord are not to assume they are excluded. Eunuchs are given words of dignity and promise. The temple is described as a house of prayer for all nations. This is another striking development. Earlier, the temple stood at the center of Judah's religious hypocrisy. People brought sacrifices while injustice continued. Now Isaiah imagines the restored house of God as a place whose purpose reaches beyond ethnic boundaries. The problem was never the temple itself. The problem was false worship. True restoration must therefore transform both worship and community. Isaiah 58 makes this explicit. The people fast. They seek God. They appear eager for religious instruction. Yet they ask why their fasting is not producing the response they want. Isaiah answers by exposing contradiction. They fast while exploiting workers. They practice religious self-denial while continuing conflict. The fast God desires is connected with loosening oppression, sharing bread with the hungry, sheltering the vulnerable, and caring for those in need. This echoes Isaiah 1. The book has traveled through kings, empires, exile, and servant songs, yet the ethical core remains consistent. Worship and justice belong together. A restored nation that repeats the old injustice has misunderstood restoration. This is why Isaiah cannot be reduced to a collection of predictions. His prophecies are about the character of a people under the rule of a holy God. The future matters because the present must be transformed. Then Isaiah's vision moves toward another figure associated with good news. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me. The speaker is anointed to bring good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to captives, and announce the year of the Lord's favor. The passage combines spiritual, social, and restorative imagery. Ruins will be rebuilt. Ancient devastations will be repaired. Mourning will be exchanged for joy. The people will become like strong trees planted for righteousness. Centuries later, according to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus will read from this passage in the synagogue at Nazareth and declare its fulfillment in relation to his own mission. Again, the connection is not accidental. Isaiah's language has been moving toward a form of salvation that includes liberation, healing, justice, restoration, and divine favor. The New Testament sees Jesus stepping into that prophetic horizon. But for Isaiah's own audience, the words first proclaim that exile and devastation do not define the final identity of the people. Ruins can be rebuilt. Captivity can end. Broken hearts can be addressed. A generation marked by shame can receive another name. Then Isaiah's vision turns toward Zion itself. The city once condemned as unfaithful is pictured in radiant terms. Nations see righteousness. Kings witness glory. Zion receives a new name. The abandoned city is no longer called forsaken. The desolate land is no longer defined by desolation. The imagery resembles a wedding. Delight replaces abandonment. The reversal is complete. Yet Isaiah still refuses to ignore the unresolved problem of sin. Near the end of the book comes a profound prayer of confession. The people acknowledge uncleanness. Righteous deeds are inadequate as a basis for pride. Sin has carried them away like wind. The prayer asks God to remember that they are His people. This is not the arrogance of the early Jerusalem elite. It is a humbled voice. The story has moved from false confidence toward confession. That change is essential. Restoration cannot be built on denial. The people must understand what brought judgment. Only then can hope become more than a return to the old pattern. And Isaiah's final horizon becomes larger still. He speaks of new heavens and a new earth. The language reaches beyond political return, beyond rebuilt walls, beyond restored agriculture, beyond the defeat of one empire. The final hope begins to sound like creation itself renewed. The earlier vision of predator and prey dwelling in peace reappears. Death, violence, labor, and blessing are reimagined. Jerusalem becomes associated with joy. The nations come into the picture again. The story that began with one sinful city has expanded toward a transformed world. This is why Isaiah became such an important book for later biblical writers. It contains a vocabulary capable of describing both Israel's historical crises and a far larger hope. Exodus, kingdom, servant, light, good news, spirit, new creation. These images will be taken up repeatedly in the New Testament. But before we move fully toward Isaiah's later legacy, one historical question remains. What happened to the prophet himself? The biblical narrative gives us far less than many people expect. Isaiah appears during the reigns of multiple kings. He is deeply involved in the days of Ahaz and Hezekiah. The superscription of the book places his prophetic activity across a long period. But Scripture does not provide a final chapter describing his death. There is no biblical scene of an execution, no detailed final speech, no account in Kings of Isaiah's last day. This silence matters because later tradition fills it with one of the most dramatic stories associated with any prophet. According to an ancient tradition, Isaiah lived into the reign of Manasseh and was killed during that king's persecution, sometimes described as being sawn in two. Hebrews 11:37 mentions faithful people who were sawn in two, and later Christian readers have often connected that phrase with Isaiah. But Hebrews does not name Isaiah there. The Bible itself does not explicitly state that Isaiah died this way. The tradition is ancient and influential. It may preserve a memory of persecution, but it must not be presented as though Isaiah 1-66 or 2 Kings directly records the event. That distinction becomes especially important because the transition from Hezekiah to Manasseh is so dramatic. Hezekiah had been associated with reform. Manasseh becomes associated with reversal. 2 Kings portrays his reign as deeply corrupt. High places are rebuilt. Baal worship returns. An Asherah is placed in relation to the temple. Astral worship is practiced. Forbidden forms of divination appear. The king is even accused of shedding very much innocent blood. The contrast could hardly be stronger. A prophet who spent decades condemning idolatry would have entered an increasingly hostile environment if he remained active into this reign. A man who confronted kings under public pressure would now face a ruler remembered for practices Isaiah had opposed throughout his ministry. The conditions for persecution were present. The later tradition therefore does not arise in a historical vacuum. But the details still belong to tradition rather than explicit biblical narration. What Scripture does make clear is enough to create a tragic pattern. Isaiah's calling had included a warning from the beginning. He would speak. Many would not listen. Cities would eventually be devastated. The message would be resisted. His commission was never a promise of public popularity. The prophet who volunteered with "Here I am, send me" had volunteered for a ministry that could cost him deeply. By this point, his message had passed through every major dimension of Judah's life. He had challenged public hypocrisy, confronted royal fear, warned against Assyria, watched Samaria fall, counseled Hezekiah, witnessed Jerusalem's deliverance, foretold Babylonian exile, spoken comfort to future exiles, described a servant who suffers, announced restoration, opened hope to the nations, and envisioned new creation. His mission had become far larger than the lifespan of one man. And that is precisely why his personal ending, however it occurred, cannot be the end of his story. Isaiah's greatest influence would begin after his voice was silent. His words would travel into exile. They would travel back with restoration. They would be read in synagogues. They would shape Jewish expectation. They would be quoted by gospel writers. They would be preached in Acts. They would appear in the letters of Paul and Peter. They would echo through Revelation. Kings who once seemed enormous would become names in history. Assyria would disappear as an empire. Babylon would fall. Persia would rise and fall. Jerusalem itself would endure destruction and rebuilding. But Isaiah's words would remain. The prophet had once been told that a stump would survive judgment. In a different sense, his own ministry would follow that pattern. The man would pass from history. The message would continue growing. And in the final stage of his story, that message would become inseparable from the way later generations understood Messiah's suffering salvation mission and the hope of a world made new. Isaiah's message had now reached beyond the crisis of one generation. He had spoken to Ahaz when fear drove Judah toward Assyria. He had stood beside Hezekiah when Assyria itself threatened Jerusalem. He had announced a future Babylonian exile that had not yet occurred, and through visions of comfort, restoration, the servant and new creation, his words had already begun to address people Isaiah himself might never live to see. But before his story can move toward its final climax, one tension must be faced. A prophet can announce restoration. That does not mean the generation hearing him will choose faithfulness. A prophet can describe a righteous future king. That does not mean every present king will become righteous. A prophet can speak of light. That does not mean darkness has disappeared. And after Hezekiah, the darkness over Judah deepened. The biblical account introduces Manasseh as Hezekiah's son and successor. If Hezekiah had represented reform, Manasseh would become associated with reversal. 2 Kings presents his reign in extraordinarily severe terms. The high places his father had destroyed were rebuilt. Altars to Baal appeared again, and Asherah was made. The host of heaven became objects of worship. Altars connected with celestial worship were placed in the courts of the house of the Lord. Practices forbidden in Israel's covenant life returned. Divination, omens, mediums, spiritists, even child sacrifice is associated with his reign. The temple that Isaiah had seen filled with the glory of the Lord in his calling vision became connected in the biblical account with practices fundamentally opposed to the holiness Isaiah had spent his life proclaiming. The contrast is devastating. Isaiah had once cried out because he was a man of unclean lips standing before a holy God. Under Manasseh, Judah increasingly acted as though holiness itself were negotiable. This was not merely a disagreement over style. It was a reversal of covenant identity. And 2 Kings goes further. Manasseh is accused of shedding very much innocent blood until Jerusalem was filled from one end to another. The text does not give a list of every victim. It does not name Isaiah, but it creates the background against which later traditions about the prophet's death would develop. If Isaiah remained active into the early period of Manasseh's reign, he would have found himself confronting perhaps the most hostile royal environment of his lifetime. He had already criticized injustice. He had already denounced idolatry. He had already warned rulers that political or religious power did not place them beyond judgment. A prophet with that record would not easily fit into a court reversing Hezekiah's reforms. This is where responsible storytelling must separate what Scripture says from what later tradition claims. The Bible does not narrate Isaiah's death. It does not tell us that Manasseh personally ordered his execution. It does not describe Isaiah being placed inside a hollow tree or being sawn apart. Those details come from later Jewish and Christian traditions, particularly writings associated with the martyrdom or ascension of Isaiah and subsequent retellings. Hebrews 11 speaks of faithful people who suffered terribly and includes the statement that some were sawn in two. For centuries, many readers have connected that phrase with Isaiah, but Hebrews does not name him. So the connection is possible within ancient tradition. It is not explicit biblical identification. That distinction does not make the tradition meaningless. It simply means we must tell the story with the same care Isaiah demanded of his own audience. What the text says, we can say. What tradition says, we can identify as tradition. What remains unknown must remain unknown. And perhaps the silence of Scripture makes Isaiah's story more striking. We know far more about some of his prophecies than we know about the final day of his life. The man disappears, the message remains. Yet before that disappearance, Isaiah's theology suggests one final challenge that had accompanied him from the beginning. Would he remain faithful if the king changed? Would he remain faithful if reform collapsed? Would he remain faithful if the people who had once listened now turned against the very message he represented? A prophetic calling is easiest to admire when we imagine the moment of commission. The temple shakes. The seraphim cry, "Holy, holy, holy." The coal touches the prophet's lips. The divine question comes, "Whom shall I send?" And Isaiah responds, "Here I am, send me." That moment is glorious. But calling is not measured only by the first yes. It is measured by every yes that follows. Yes when the message is welcomed. Yes when it is rejected. Yes when a king listens. Yes when a king refuses. Yes when the city is delivered. Yes when the future contains exile. Yes when hope is visible. Yes when the prophet himself may receive no earthly reward for faithfulness. Isaiah's original commission had warned him of this. The people would hear without truly hearing. They would see without truly perceiving. The ministry would continue until devastation came. That warning prevents us from romanticizing his career. Isaiah did not receive a promise that everyone would recognize him as right. He received a command to speak. This distinction is one of the deepest lessons of his life. Success and faithfulness are not always identical. A prophet may be faithful and still be ignored. A warning may be true and still be rejected. A generation may possess revelation and still choose rebellion. Isaiah's authority never rested upon public approval. It rested upon the one who called him. The tension becomes even stronger when we consider what happened to Judah after Isaiah's generation. Manasseh's reign lasts for decades. 2 Kings later presents his sins as one of the major reasons judgment against Jerusalem becomes unavoidable. Even when later rulers introduce reform, the consequences of long-term rebellion are not simply erased. Eventually, Babylon will come. The prediction Isaiah gave Hezekiah will become history. The royal treasures will be taken. Jerusalem will fall. The temple will burn. Members of the royal family will be carried into exile. The city, whose survival under Assyria had once seemed miraculous, will not survive forever. This is why Isaiah's warning after Hezekiah showed Babylon's envoys the royal treasures was so important. The prophet was not contradicting Jerusalem's earlier deliverance. He was teaching the difference between mercy and immunity. Jerusalem had been spared from Sennacherib. It had not been granted permission to rebel indefinitely. The temple had witnessed divine glory. That did not make the building invulnerable to judgment. The house of David carried promises. That did not mean every Davidic king could act without consequences. Biblical hope is stronger than denial because biblical hope survives judgment rather than pretending judgment cannot happen. This is what makes Isaiah's later promises so powerful. If Jerusalem could never fall, the promise of restoration would be unnecessary. If exile were impossible, comfort for exiles would mean little. If David's dynasty never appeared, cut down the image of a shoot from Jesse's stump would lose its force. If the people were never spiritually blind, the servant's mission would not be needed. If sin were a small problem, the suffering servant's burden would be difficult to understand. The greatness of Isaiah's hope depends on the seriousness of the crisis, and the crisis becomes more than political. Throughout the book, Isaiah identifies a pattern that runs beneath every external catastrophe. Human beings repeatedly trust what they can see: armies, treasures, alliances, idols, kings, institutions, their own wisdom. But visible things are temporary. This does not make them meaningless. A wise king matters. Justice matters. Military decisions matter. Public institutions matter. Yet none of them can bear the weight of ultimate trust. Ahaz learned this with Assyria. Hezekiah nearly learned it again through Egypt and foreign diplomacy. Assyria learned it through its arrogance. Babylon would eventually learn it through its own fall. Isaiah's message repeatedly strips away the illusion that power makes anything permanent. Only then can the prophet speak meaningfully about the kingdom that will endure. This brings us back to the extraordinary figure Isaiah had described: a child associated with David's throne, a shoot from Jesse, a servant bringing justice, a servant restoring Israel, a servant bringing light to the nations, a servant suffering on behalf of others, a spirit-anointed herald proclaiming good news. Across the book, these images do not all appear in exactly the same form, and interpreters have long discussed how they relate to one another. But together, they create a prophetic expectation that human kings have not fulfilled. Ahaz could not fulfill it. Hezekiah, despite his strengths, could not fulfill it completely. Every righteous act of a good king exposed how much more was still needed. Every failure of a bad king made that need even clearer. Judah did not merely need better policies. It needed righteous rule at a deeper level. This is one reason Isaiah became so central to Christian understanding of Jesus. The New Testament does not cite Isaiah occasionally. It returns to him again and again. The opening of Mark's Gospel places Isaiah at the beginning of the story of John the Baptist and Jesus. Matthew repeatedly uses Isaiah to interpret events surrounding Jesus. Luke records Jesus reading Isaiah in the synagogue. John quotes Isaiah when reflecting on unbelief. Acts uses Isaiah in discussions of mission and the suffering servant. Paul draws upon Isaiah while speaking about Israel, the nation's proclamation and salvation. Peter uses servant language when explaining Christ's suffering. Revelation echoes Isaiah's images of worship, judgment, nations, and new creation. For the writers of the New Testament, Isaiah did not merely predict isolated facts centuries earlier. His entire theological world helped them explain what they believed God was doing through Jesus. This is crucial. If we treat prophecy only as a list of predictions, we miss the architecture of Isaiah's message. The New Testament sees continuity in themes: the holiness of God, the blindness of people, the need for cleansing, the Davidic king, the servant, the Spirit, good news, light to the nations, forgiveness, restoration, new creation. These themes form a landscape. Jesus is presented within that landscape. Consider Isaiah's calling itself. The prophet sees the Lord high and lifted up. In the Gospel of John, after quoting from Isaiah 6 to explain unbelief, the writer makes an extraordinary statement connecting Isaiah's vision with the glory of Christ. For Christian interpretation, Isaiah's temple vision becomes more than an ancient prophetic experience. It becomes part of how the identity of Jesus is understood. Or consider Immanuel. In Isaiah's immediate setting, the sign belongs to the crisis of Ahaz and the threatened house of David. Matthew later applies the Immanuel language to Jesus' birth. The historical setting is not erased. Instead, the theme reaches a fuller expression: God with us. The political crisis of one Davidic king becomes part of a much larger theological claim. Then Isaiah 9. A child is born, a son is given. Rule rests upon him. Peace and justice are associated with David's throne. For centuries, Christians have read these words through the kingship of Jesus. Again, the contrast with Isaiah's actual kings is essential. Ahaz failed. Hezekiah was limited. Manasseh became notorious for evil. The human monarchy continually demonstrated the gap between the Davidic ideal and political reality. The promise therefore grows larger as history exposes human insufficiency. Isaiah 11 deepens the expectation. A shoot from Jesse's stump. A spirit-endowed ruler. Righteous judgment. Protection for the poor. Peace reaching into creation itself. Paul later quotes from this chapter while speaking about hope extending to the Gentiles. The ruler from Jesse's line does not merely stabilize Judah. The nations hope in him. This fits the expanding movement already present inside Isaiah. The promise to Israel opens outward. The servant becomes a light to the nations. The temple becomes a house of prayer for all peoples. The ends of the earth witness salvation. Isaiah's vision does not dissolve Israel's story, it expands its significance. Then comes the servant. No passage has shaped Christian reflection on the suffering of Jesus more profoundly than Isaiah 52 and 53. The earliest Christians had to answer a difficult question. If Jesus was Messiah, why did he suffer rejection and crucifixion? Roman execution did not look like victory. A crucified man did not look like the triumphant ruler many expected. Isaiah gave them language. Despised, rejected, suffering, silent before accusers, bearing the sins of others, cut off, yet ultimately vindicated. The servant song allowed suffering and divine purpose to inhabit the same story. What looked like defeat could become the path through which salvation was accomplished. This is not because Isaiah described every detail of the crucifixion as though he were watching a future scene unfold with modern precision. Biblical prophecy is often richer and more literary than that. The New Testament sees Jesus embodying the servant pattern Isaiah had developed. Faithful, rejected, suffering, bearing sin, vindicated. And this reading radically reshapes the meaning of kingship. The king Isaiah hopes for and the servant Isaiah describes are not easily reduced to ordinary ancient political categories. The Messiah does not merely defeat enemies from a throne. In Christian interpretation, he first suffers. Power and sacrifice meet. The one who rules is also the one who serves. The one who is exalted first accepts humiliation. This is one of Isaiah's deepest reversals, and it echoes the prophet's own experience. Isaiah's authority began not in self-exaltation, but confession. Woe is me! The prophet had to be cleansed before he was commissioned. The servant's path similarly moves through humility before exaltation. God's work repeatedly overturns human expectations about greatness. Assyria boasts and is humbled. The servant is humbled and is exalted. The proud city is brought low. The barren woman sings. The wilderness blooms. The exiles return. The nations once viewed as enemies are invited toward worship. The kingdom that appears cut down produces a shoot. Isaiah's theology is built upon reversals. This is why Manasseh's dark reign, if Isaiah lived into it, cannot be treated as the final verdict on Isaiah's ministry. A hostile king does not erase a true prophecy. A martyr's death, if the tradition is correct, does not represent the defeat of the message. In fact, Isaiah's own servant theology would have prepared later readers to understand that suffering and faithfulness are not opposites. A servant may suffer precisely because he remains faithful. A prophet may be rejected precisely because he refuses to change the message. The final test of Isaiah's life, therefore, is not whether he escapes suffering. It is whether the word remains true when circumstances appear to deny it. And that word reaches even farther than Messiah and restoration. Isaiah ultimately speaks about a new heavens and a new earth. This is the horizon toward which the book moves. Human history, as Isaiah knows it, is not the final condition of creation. The cycle of pride, violence, empire, judgment, reform, failure, and renewed judgment will not continue forever. Something fundamentally new lies ahead. Isaiah 65 presents this future using imagery of joy, security, fruitful labor, peace, and a transformed relationship within creation. The language is poetic and prophetic. It should not be flattened into a technical blueprint, but its direction is unmistakable. God's purpose does not end with bringing exiles back to Jerusalem. Restoration reaches beyond geography. The Creator who began history retains a purpose for creation itself. This final horizon connects Isaiah with the last book of the Christian Bible. Revelation uses the language of a new heaven and a new earth. It describes tears wiped away, death defeated, the nations gathered, the holy city transformed. The Bible's final vision, therefore, echoes themes Isaiah had announced centuries earlier. This gives Isaiah a remarkable position in the biblical story. His ministry occurs in a relatively specific historical period. Judah, Jerusalem, the 8th century before Christ. Assyria, Ahaz, Hezekiah. Yet the language of his book stretches from his own political crisis to the farthest horizon of biblical hope. Few prophets move so naturally between an army outside a city wall and the renewal of creation. That scale is part of Isaiah's greatness, but it also makes the prophet easy to misunderstand. One danger is to remove him from history and treat him only as a collection of predictions about Jesus. That misses Ahaz, Assyria, Hezekiah, the fall of Samaria, the threat of Babylon, the social injustice Isaiah condemned, the immediate meaning his words had for Judah. The opposite danger is to keep Isaiah so completely inside the 8th century that his later biblical influence is ignored. That misses the way Scripture itself continues using him. A responsible reading has to hold both together. Isaiah spoke into history, and the biblical canon carries his words beyond that history. The same is true of the servant songs. The same is true of Immanuel. The same is true of the Davidic ruler. The same is true of new creation. Isaiah's prophecies have an original setting. They also acquire canonical significance as later biblical writers interpret them. This layered reading does not weaken the text. It shows why Isaiah remained alive to communities centuries after his death. An exile in Babylon could read Isaiah differently from a court official under Hezekiah. A Jewish community returning to Jerusalem could hear restoration language differently from those who first received warning. A follower of Jesus could hear the servant songs in a new way after the crucifixion and resurrection. A persecuted church could hear Isaiah's promise of new creation as a reason to endure. The words remain the same. History changes around them. Their significance unfolds. This may explain why the prophet's own death receives so little space compared with his message. Scripture often surprises us in what it chooses not to record. We may want a final conversation, a dramatic farewell, the prophet surrounded by disciples, a last confrontation with Manasseh, a detailed martyrdom scene. But none is given in the biblical narrative. We must resist the temptation to invent what would make the story more cinematic. The silence itself tells us where the biblical emphasis lies. Not on the spectacle of Isaiah's death, on the endurance of Isaiah's word. Still, the later martyrdom tradition deserves to be understood because it shaped the way generations remembered him. The work, commonly known as the Martyrdom of Isaiah, describes persecution under Manasseh and presents a horrific execution by sawing. Later Christian traditions repeated the account. Ancient writers associated Isaiah with the unnamed faithful sufferers of Hebrews 11. The image became powerful. A prophet who saw divine glory dies under a corrupt king. The mouth purified by the coal refuses to become silent. The man who said, "Send me," remains faithful to the end. It is easy to see why the tradition endured. It fits the broad biblical portrait of prophetic opposition. Prophets are often rejected. Micaiah is imprisoned. Jeremiah is persecuted. Zechariah is killed in the temple court in one biblical account. John the Baptist is executed by a king. Jesus laments Jerusalem as a city associated with killing prophets. So a martyrdom tradition surrounding Isaiah is not conceptually out of place. But plausibility is not proof. We should not turn an ancient tradition into a biblical quotation. Isaiah's exact death remains historically uncertain. And perhaps that uncertainty should sharpen rather than weaken the ending of his story. Because Isaiah's legacy does not depend on knowing the instrument of his death, his influence does not rest on whether he died peacefully under persecution or by the specific method later tradition describes. His importance rests on what he faithfully proclaimed. The Holy One reigns. Human pride will fall. Judgment is real. A remnant survives. The house of David is not forgotten. A righteous ruler is coming. The servant will bring justice and light. The servant will suffer. Salvation will reach beyond Israel. The broken can be restored. The exiled can return. The nations can come. Creation itself can be made new. This is the message that outlives the messenger. And yet there is still one major tension Isaiah must carry into the climax of his story. How can these promises actually coexist to it? How can a holy God judge sin and still restore sinners? How can a guilty people become a righteous people? How can the servant bear what others deserve? How can the Davidic hope survive failed kings? How can the nations be included without erasing Israel's calling? How can new creation emerge from a world still dominated by death? Isaiah does not answer every theological question in the systematic form later readers might prefer. He gives images, prophecies, songs, judgments, promises, a child, a branch, a servant, a highway, a restored city, a feast, a new creation. Together they form a prophetic vision. And in the next movement of Isaiah's story, these strands must converge. The prophet's personal journey is approaching its end. The final biblical record of his life grows silent. Tradition places suffering beyond that silence. But the great climax of Isaiah is no longer about whether one prophet survives one king. It is about whether the vision entrusted to him can survive everything history will throw against it. Assyria, Babylon, exile, failed kings, national sin, foreign domination, the prophet's own death, century after century. If Isaiah's message is true, then none of those things can have the final word. The empire will not. The grave will not. Exile will not. Judgment will not. Even the apparent failure of the messenger will not. The question Isaiah carried from his calling is now reaching its largest form. Who truly rules history? And the answer will determine whether his prophecies remain the dream of a forgotten prophet or become part of the central story by which generations understand salvation itself. Isaiah's greatest prophecy was never about the survival of Isaiah. It was about the survival of the promise. Kings had come and gone. Uzziah had died. Jotham had ruled. Ahaz had refused the path of trust. Hezekiah had prayed, reformed, stumbled, recovered, and eventually passed from the stage of history. Assyria had seemed unstoppable. Samaria had fallen. Jerusalem had nearly been surrounded by catastrophe. Babylon had appeared on the horizon. And beyond the biblical record, later tradition would remember Isaiah himself as a victim of persecution. Yet through every change, the central question remained. Could the purposes Isaiah proclaimed survive the failure of the very people entrusted with them? Could the promise survive rebellion? Could David's line survive failed kings? Could Israel's calling survive exile? Could holiness and mercy meet without either being diminished? Could judgment be real without becoming the final word? Isaiah's answer unfolds not through one isolated prediction, but through a constellation of images that eventually converge. A child, a king, a branch, a servant, a messenger, a restored Zion, a highway through the wilderness, a feast for the nations, death swallowed up, a new heavens and a new earth. Taken individually, each image is powerful. Taken together, they form one of the broadest visions of redemption in the Old Testament. And this is where Isaiah's story reaches its theological climax. The prophet who began by seeing the Holy One now sees what holiness will require from history. The first problem Isaiah confronted was sin, not military weakness, not lack of economic prosperity, not the absence of religious activity. Sin. Judah could possess sacrifices and still be guilty. Jerusalem could possess the temple and still become corrupt. Kings could sit on David's throne and still rebel. The nation could speak the language of covenant and still live contrary to it. If restoration simply returned the same people to the same land under the same conditions, the cycle would begin again. Therefore, Isaiah's hope has to go deeper than national recovery. Something has to happen to the people themselves. This is why the servant becomes so central. Isaiah had already called Israel God's servant. The nation was chosen to witness, chosen to know, chosen to represent. But the servant Israel was often blind and deaf. The people needed the very salvation they were meant to announce. Then the servant songs began presenting a figure who appears to carry Israel's calling faithfully. He listens, he obeys, he brings justice, he becomes a light to the nations. He restores Jacob, and then in the most mysterious movement, he suffers. The servant does not merely confront the consequences of sin, he bears them. Isaiah 52 begins by announcing his eventual exaltation. The servant will act wisely. He will be raised, lifted up, highly exalted. Those words might prepare the reader for royal glory. Instead, the next image is shocking. His appearance has been marred. People are astonished. The pathway to exaltation moves through humiliation. Kings will ultimately recognize what they had not understood. Something hidden from ordinary expectations is being revealed. Then Isaiah asks, "Who has believed the message?" The servant grows like a tender shoot. Again, vegetation imagery appears. Earlier, the house of David was compared to a stump from which new growth emerges. Now the servant appears without the outward splendor people might expect. There is no obvious majesty that guarantees admiration. He is despised, rejected, familiar with suffering. People turn their faces away. And then comes the reversal of understanding. At first, observers believe his suffering belongs to him. He must be suffering because of his own guilt. But then they realize he has carried something belonging to them. Surely he has borne our griefs. He has carried our sorrows. He was wounded because of our transgressions, crushed because of our iniquities. The language is representative. The servant stands in relation to the guilt of others. The punishment associated with peace falls upon him. Through his wounds comes healing. The people are compared to sheep. All have wandered. Each has turned toward his own way, yet the iniquity of the many is placed upon one. This is an extraordinary development in Isaiah's theology of restoration. Earlier sacrificial imagery had appeared in the temple system Isaiah knew. Isaiah himself had experienced symbolic cleansing when the burning coal touched his lips. But now the servant's own suffering is described with language of bearing wrongdoing. The one who is faithful suffers in relation to those who are not, and he does so without the kind of violent retaliation expected from political power. He is oppressed, afflicted, yet he does not answer his accusers in the ordinary way. Like a lamb led to slaughter, he remains silent. He is taken away through oppression and judgment. He is cut off from the land of the living. A grave enters the prophecy. The servant dies. At that moment, the promise appears to have collapsed. How can the servant complete his mission if he is dead? How can the one meant to restore others be himself cut off? How can humiliation lead to exaltation? Isaiah does not leave the servant in the grave. The poem moves beyond death into vindication. The servant will see the result of his suffering. He will justify many. He will bear their iniquities. He receives a portion with the great. He is numbered with transgressors, yet bears the sin of many and intercedes for transgressors. Death has not canceled his mission. Somehow suffering has become part of that mission. This is the theological reversal at the center of Isaiah's servant vision. Human empires achieve victory by transferring suffering onto others. The servant achieves his purpose by taking suffering upon himself. Assyria gloried in the humiliation of captives. The servant enters humiliation. Kings sought greatness by protecting themselves. The servant gives himself. The logic of power has been inverted. Centuries later, this is precisely why the earliest Christians repeatedly returned to Isaiah after the crucifixion of Jesus. The death of Jesus had created an enormous interpretive problem. If he was the Messiah, why had he been executed? If he was the promised king, why did Rome crucify him? If he represented God's kingdom, why did he appear defeated? Isaiah provided a category that allowed suffering and mission to coexist. The Messiah could suffer without the suffering disproving his mission. The servant could be rejected without rejection becoming the final verdict. Humiliation could precede exaltation. Death could occur without ending the purpose of God. In Acts, an Ethiopian official reads from Isaiah's servant passage while traveling. He encounters the words about one led like a sheep to slaughter. He asks whom the prophet is describing. Philip begins from that scripture and announces the good news about Jesus. The episode illustrates how quickly Isaiah became central to Christian proclamation. The gospel writers also repeatedly draw upon the prophet. Matthew uses Isaiah's language of Immanuel. Mark opens his account of Jesus' ministry within prophetic imagery that includes Isaiah's voice crying in the wilderness. Luke describes Jesus reading Isaiah 61 in Nazareth. John reflects on unbelief through Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 53. Peter uses language closely associated with Isaiah 53 to explain Christ's suffering. The New Testament does not treat Isaiah as an optional background text. It repeatedly presents his vocabulary as part of the framework needed to understand Jesus. And this connection reaches beyond the servant's suffering. Consider Isaiah's hope for a Davidic ruler. Ahaz had shown what fear could do to a king. Hezekiah had shown that even a faithful king remained limited. Manasseh would demonstrate how destructive royal apostasy could become. If Judah's ultimate hope depended upon finding one more ordinary king who happened to perform slightly better than the last, Isaiah's vision would be too large for the solution. He speaks instead of a ruler characterized by righteousness at the deepest level. The Spirit rests upon him. Wisdom defines him. He judges rightly. The poor receive justice. His reign is associated with peace so profound that Isaiah expresses it through transformed creation. This ruler emerges from Jesse's line. Davidic hope survives even after the monarchy appears reduced to a stump. For Christian readers, Jesus becomes the point at which the servant and king themes meet. The Messiah rules, but he rules through service. He is exalted, but he first suffers. He confronts sin, but he also bears sin. He brings a kingdom, but not by imitating Assyria. The pattern of Isaiah is fulfilled through a form of kingship the world repeatedly fails to recognize. The Gospel of Luke makes another Isaiah connection especially vivid. Jesus enters a synagogue in Nazareth. He reads from the scroll of Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Good news to the poor, liberty to captives, sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed, the year of the Lord's favor." Then Jesus says that the scripture is being fulfilled in the hearing of those present. For Isaiah's original prophetic horizon, the passage announced restoration after devastation. Broken lives would be rebuilt. Captivity would end. Good news would reach those crushed by circumstances. In Luke, Jesus places his own mission within that restoration. Isaiah's hope has become a language for explaining what salvation looks like when it enters human suffering. And once again, the theme extends beyond Israel. Isaiah had declared that the servant's mission was too great to end with the restoration of Jacob alone. He would become a light to the nations. The book of Acts draws upon this language as the gospel moves outward. Paul and Barnabas cite Isaiah when explaining their mission among Gentiles. The geography changes. Jerusalem, Judea, the wider Roman world. But Isaiah's prophetic pattern remains recognizable. The light is traveling outward. This does not mean Israel has become irrelevant. Paul himself wrestles deeply with Israel's place in God's purposes, especially in Romans. And there too Isaiah appears repeatedly. Paul cites Isaiah while discussing the remnant. He uses the prophet while explaining both Israel's unbelief and the inclusion of the nations. The same tension Isaiah carried continues. Judgment and promise, hardness and remnant. Israel's calling and salvation reaching outward. The New Testament does not solve these themes by pretending Isaiah's original concerns never existed. It sees the story continuing. That is why the concept of the remnant becomes so important. Isaiah's own son, Shir-Yashub, had carried the message in his name. A remnant shall return. At the beginning of Isaiah's ministry, this was tied to impending judgment. The nation would suffer severe reduction, but something would remain. Later, the remnant idea becomes part of a broader theology of grace. The promise continues, not because every member of every generation responds faithfully, but because God does not abandon his purpose when people fail. Paul will later use Isaiah's remnant language while reflecting on his own generation. Again, Isaiah's historical world becomes a framework for later theological interpretation. And the same happens with Isaiah's language of good news. Today, the word gospel can sound specifically Christian, but its basic sense is good news. Isaiah had spoken of a messenger bringing good news to Zion and declaring, "Your God reigns." That announcement belongs to a world in which exile appears to contradict divine kingship. The good news is that Babylon has not defeated the true king. Restoration is coming. When the New Testament speaks of gospel, it does so in a biblical world already shaped by announcements of divine reign, deliverance, and restoration. The Christian gospel claims that the reign of God has entered history decisively through Jesus. Isaiah supplies part of the vocabulary. The same is true of John the Baptist. Isaiah 40 had described a voice crying out to prepare the way of the Lord through the wilderness. In its original context, the image belongs to the promise of return, a new exodus, a path through the wilderness, God leading his people again. The Gospels apply this imagery to John preparing the way for Jesus. The implication is enormous. Jesus' arrival is being presented through the language of a new act of divine deliverance. The Exodus pattern is moving again. But now the bondage being addressed reaches beyond one empire. This is where the layers of Isaiah begin converging: the new Exodus, the servant, the Davidic king, the Spirit, good news, forgiveness, light to the nations, a renewed people. These are not identical images, yet in New Testament interpretation they increasingly gather around the person and mission of Jesus. This is why Isaiah came to be called by some Christian writers almost an evangelist among the prophets. But that description must be used carefully. Isaiah was not a Christian writer living centuries before Christianity. He was a prophet of Judah, speaking into his own covenant and historical world. His message mattered to Ahaz before Matthew ever quoted it. His warning mattered to Jerusalem before the Gospels existed. His promise of restoration mattered to exiles before Acts took the message to Gentiles. Respecting those contexts does not weaken the Christian reading. It actually shows how vast the continuity is. The same themes develop across centuries. And one of the largest themes is Zion. Isaiah's Jerusalem is contradictory. It is the city associated with David, the city of the temple, the city Isaiah condemns for corruption, the city Assyria threatens, the city God preserves, the city Babylon will eventually destroy, the city Isaiah imagines restored. Zion becomes both a real place and a theological symbol. At times, Isaiah speaks directly about the historical city. At other times, the vision expands until Zion represents the center of a transformed future in which nations come toward divine light. Isaiah 60 portrays nations coming to that light. Kings approach brightness. Wealth flows toward the restored city. Foreigners participate in rebuilding. Violence and devastation give way to peace. The imagery is grand, but its theological center is not Jerusalem becoming an empire like Assyria. Zion's glory comes from the presence and light of God. This matters. Isaiah does not imagine salvation as Judah finally becoming the oppressor. The goal is not revenge through reversed imperial domination. The final vision transforms the relationship between nations. This is already anticipated in Isaiah 2, where nations come to learn rather than to be conquered. They transform swords into agricultural tools. The knowledge of God interrupts the cycle of war. At the beginning of Isaiah's ministry, this vision appeared almost impossible. Assyria was expanding. Kings were calculating war. Cities were preparing defenses. Yet the prophet placed peace at the end of the story. That hope becomes even more extraordinary when Isaiah 25 describes a feast for all peoples, a rich feast, a mountain, a covering removed, tears wiped away, and then one of the most astonishing promises, death swallowed up forever. Here Isaiah's horizon moves beyond exile. Even the return from Babylon cannot fulfill this completely. People who return from exile still die. Rebuilt cities still face future destruction. Political restoration alone cannot swallow death. Isaiah's hope is pushing beyond ordinary national recovery. The enemy is no longer merely Assyria or Babylon. The horizon includes death itself. The Apostle Paul later quotes Isaiah's language while discussing resurrection. Death is swallowed up in victory. A prophetic image of final divine triumph becomes part of Christian hope concerning resurrection. Again, the pattern is visible. Isaiah speaks within Israel's story. The New Testament sees the trajectory reaching its climax through Christ. This is the third layer of Isaiah's great climax. First comes the historical layer. Judah faces judgment and restoration. Second comes the messianic and servant layer. A righteous ruler and faithful servant becomes central to the hope. Third comes the cosmic layer. The nations are gathered. Death is defeated. Creation is renewed. The story becomes larger at every stage. And yet, Isaiah never allows this grand future to become an excuse for moral indifference in the present. Near the end of the book, the prophet again asks what genuine worship looks like. God is not impressed by religious performance detached from humility. He looks toward the humble and contrite, the person who trembles at his word. This brings Isaiah back almost exactly to where he began. In Isaiah 1, Judah had sacrifices without justice. In Isaiah 6, the prophet trembled before holiness. Near the conclusion of the book, true worship is again associated with humility and responsiveness to God. The entire journey has not changed the basic requirement. Holiness matters. But now Isaiah has shown that human beings cannot simply produce holiness through outward ritual. They need cleansing. They need restoration. They need the work of God. This makes Isaiah's own calling scene a miniature version of the larger story. Isaiah enters divine presence unclean. He recognizes his condition. He cannot cleanse himself. The coal comes from the altar. His guilt is taken away. Then he is sent. Cleansed people become commissioned people. Grace produces mission. That same pattern can be seen on a larger scale throughout the book. Judah is guilty. Judgment comes. God restores. The restored people become witnesses. The servant becomes a light to the nations. Zion becomes a place toward which nations come. Salvation produces mission. This is one reason Isaiah's message remains more than a personal story about one prophet. His calling mirrors the calling of the people. He experiences in miniature what he proclaims in history: uncleanness, cleansing, commission. And Isaiah's final vision pushes commission toward the ends of the earth. In Isaiah 66, the book's horizon includes people from many nations and languages. God's glory is declared among them. Some are sent toward distant peoples who have not heard. The story that began with Jerusalem's sins now reaches the nations. But the final chapter does not become sentimental. Judgment remains present. Isaiah does not end by claiming every human decision has become irrelevant. The distinction between rebellion and faithfulness still matters. His vision of new creation exists alongside severe warnings about rejecting God. This is consistent with his entire ministry. Mercy never turns sin into something harmless. Judgment never makes mercy impossible. Isaiah refuses to sacrifice either truth, and that balance may be the defining theological tension of his work. A holy God judges, a merciful God restores. The servant stands at the point where these themes become most mysterious. Sin is not ignored, it is born. The guilty do not save themselves, another acts on their behalf. For Christian theology, this becomes one of the Old Testament's clearest pathways toward understanding the cross. But Isaiah's vision does not end at the cross. The servant is vindicated. Zion sings, good news spreads. The nations receive light. Creation moves toward renewal. The movement is from suffering to glory, from judgment to restoration, from death toward life. This is why the resurrection of Jesus becomes so important to Christian reading of Isaiah. If the servant suffers and dies, but the story ends there, exaltation remains unresolved. If Isaiah hopes for death to be swallowed up, death must eventually face defeat. The New Testament proclamation of resurrection claims that this reversal has begun. Jesus is not merely a suffering servant, he is the vindicated servant, not merely the crucified king, the risen king, not merely one who announces new creation, the one through whom new creation begins. Paul's letters repeatedly interpret resurrection as more than one miracle happening to one individual. It becomes the beginning of something larger. Isaiah's final horizons make such a claim intelligible. If the prophetic goal is new creation, then resurrection is not a strange addition to the story, it belongs near the center of it. And Revelation carries this logic to its final biblical scene. The seer describes a new heaven and new earth. The holy city appears in transformed glory. Nations are present. Kings bring honor. The imagery of light glory worship and renewed creation strongly echoes Isaiah. The final pages of the Christian Bible therefore sound like the ancient prophet. This is a remarkable legacy. Isaiah began during the reign of kings whose names many modern readers struggle to remember. He spoke about alliances involving kingdoms that no longer exist. He watched Assyria reshape a political world long vanished. Yet the Bible ends using language shaped by his vision. The prophet's historical world disappeared. His theological horizon endured. This is the great climax of Isaiah's story. Not one prediction, not one battle, not one king. The climax is the convergence. The holy God Isaiah saw remains sovereign over history. Judgment exposes human rebellion. The remnant preserves the promise. The Davidic hope survives failed monarchs. The servant embodies faithful mission. The servant suffers for others. The Spirit announces good news. The nations receive light. Death itself is challenged. Creation moves toward renewal. And later biblical writers recognize these streams coming together in Jesus and extending toward the final restoration of all things. Isaiah's entire ministry can therefore be viewed as movement between two visions. The first is Isaiah 6. A throne, holiness, smoke, a trembling prophet, a commission. The final horizon is new creation, a renewed world, restored worship, nations gathered. The glory of God no longer appearing only within one temple vision, but filling the future toward which the prophetic story moves. Between those two visions lies human history. Rebellion, war, kings, empires, exile, suffering, hope. The prophet never pretends the middle is easy. He simply refuses to let the middle become the ending. And that is why even Isaiah's own death cannot function as the final climax. Suppose the later tradition is correct. Suppose Isaiah did suffer execution under Manasseh. Suppose the prophet who once said, "Here I am, send me," eventually faced a king unwilling to tolerate his witness. Then the irony would be profound. A ruler could destroy the prophet's body. He could not destroy the prophecy. Manasseh's palace disappeared. Assyria disappeared. Babylon disappeared as the dominant empire. Persia eventually disappeared as the ruling empire. Every government Isaiah feared, confronted, or anticipated entered history and left it. The words remained. And if the martyrdom tradition is not historically exact, the deeper point remains unchanged. Isaiah eventually died. Every prophet does. The messenger is mortal. The message points beyond him. The servant Isaiah described would later become more famous than Isaiah himself. The Messiah he anticipated would become the center of Christian interpretation. The restoration he proclaimed would give hope to generations facing loss. The new creation he envisioned would echo from the closing chapters of Scripture. Isaiah's life may have ended in silence. His voice did not. Yet one final task remains. We have followed the prophet from Jerusalem under Uzziah through Ahaz's fear, Assyria's advance, Hezekiah's crisis, Babylon's shadow, the servant's suffering, and the horizon of new creation. But what can we actually say about Isaiah's final years? Where does Scripture end and tradition begin? Why did later generations remember him as a martyr? And how did this one prophet become so influential that passages from his book appear throughout the New Testament and continue shaping how millions of people understand Messiah, salvation, judgment, and hope? The great theological climax has been revealed. Now the story must return to the man. Isaiah had once answered the call without knowing how long the road would be. "Here I am, send me." Decades later, the throne of Judah had changed hands again. Hezekiah's era was ending. A darker reign was approaching. And somewhere beyond the final clear biblical scenes of Isaiah's life, the prophet himself was about to disappear from the historical record. What remained after him would become his true monument. Not a palace, not an army, not a dynasty. A scroll, and words that history could not silence. Isaiah disappears from the biblical record without the kind of ending readers often expect. There is no final chapter describing his last sermon, no farewell speech, no scene in which he gathers disciples around him, no account of the exact day he died, no biblical description of his burial, no final confrontation with a king recorded in the narrative. For a prophet whose words fill one of the longest and most influential books in Scripture, the silence is striking. And that silence forces us to make an important distinction. There is the Isaiah we can reconstruct from the biblical text, and there is the Isaiah remembered by later tradition. Those two pictures overlap, but they are not identical. The biblical Isaiah is firmly rooted in the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. His book identifies those kings as the historical framework of his prophetic ministry. He confronts the spiritual corruption of Judah. He speaks during the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. He warns Ahaz. He watches Assyria transform the political world. He counsels Hezekiah. He announces Jerusalem's deliverance. He warns that Babylon will one day carry away Judah's treasures and royal descendants. Then the direct narrative about his life fades. If Isaiah survived into the reign of Manasseh, as ancient tradition claims, he would have witnessed a dramatic reversal. Hezekiah's son became king, and the biblical portrait of Manasseh is dark. The reforms associated with Hezekiah were undone. High places returned, Baal worship reappeared, and Asherah was introduced. Worship of the heavenly bodies spread. Practices condemned in Israel's covenant law became part of the religious life of the kingdom. 2 Kings even says that Manasseh shed very much innocent blood. For anyone who had spent decades preaching the holiness of God, condemning idolatry, and confronting injustice, such a reign would have represented almost everything Isaiah had warned against. But Scripture does not say, "And Manasseh killed Isaiah." That statement comes from later tradition. One ancient account associated with the martyrdom of Isaiah describes the prophet fleeing persecution and then eventually being killed by being sawn apart. The story became influential in Jewish and Christian memory. Later writers repeated it, and Hebrews 11:37, while listing the sufferings endured by faithful people, mentions that some were sawn in two. Because of the older tradition, many readers have identified Isaiah as the person behind that phrase. It is possible. It became a widely accepted interpretation in later Christian tradition, but Hebrews does not name him. That means the responsible conclusion is simple. Isaiah may have died as a martyr under Manasseh. Ancient tradition strongly associates him with such a death, but the canonical biblical text does not explicitly record the event. This matters especially because the title of Isaiah's story often ends with his tragic death. The tragedy should not be exaggerated into false certainty. History does not become more meaningful when we pretend to know what the sources leave uncertain. In fact, Isaiah's uncertain ending fits the larger shape of his life remarkably well. His ministry had never been primarily about himself. The prophet enters the story as a messenger, and messengers are measured by what they carry. Isaiah's calling began with a question: "Whom shall I send?" His answer was immediate: "Here I am, send me." Everything afterward became the cost of that answer. He had to speak when the message was unpopular. He had to challenge the appearance of national security. He had to tell worshippers that sacrifices without justice were unacceptable. He had to tell the powerful that pride would be brought low. He had to tell Ahaz that the coalition terrifying him would not have the final word. Then he had to tell Judah that Assyria, the empire Ahaz trusted, would itself become a danger. He had to watch the northern kingdom collapse. He had to stand beside Hezekiah while Jerusalem faced an enemy that had already destroyed stronger cities. He had to announce hope when the city seemed doomed. And after Jerusalem survived, he had to announce that another judgment still waited beyond the horizon. This is not the career of a prophet, telling people what they want to hear. Isaiah's task was more difficult. He had to destroy false confidence without destroying hope. He had to announce judgment without teaching despair. He had to proclaim mercy without making sin insignificant. He had to speak of Israel's calling without pretending Israel had fulfilled it. He had to promise a future king while living under kings who repeatedly failed. He had to speak about a servant who would succeed through suffering in a world where power was measured by conquest. He had to imagine peace while empires marched. And he had to believe restoration could emerge from a history that seemed determined to repeat its own failures. This balance is part of what made Isaiah's message endure. His prophecy is not optimistic because people are reliable. People in Isaiah are frequently unreliable. Kings fail. Officials corrupt justice. Worshippers maintain rituals while ignoring righteousness. Nations become arrogant. Allies become dangerous. Even Hezekiah, one of Judah's better kings, reveals limitations. Isaiah's hope rests somewhere else, on the character of God. That is why the first great title Isaiah gives us is not Messiah, not servant, not remnant. It is Holiness. Holy, holy, holy. Everything flows from that vision. God's holiness explains judgment because evil matters. God's sovereignty explains why empires are limited because no emperor is ultimate. God's faithfulness explains the remnant because human failure does not cancel every promise. God's mercy explains restoration because judgment is not his only work. And God's purpose explains why Isaiah's vision eventually reaches beyond Judah to the nations. The prophet's whole world is held together by the one seated on the throne. Once we understand that many of Isaiah's apparent contradictions begin to make sense, how can Isaiah speak so severely about Jerusalem and still love Zion because the city's calling is too important to allow corruption to remain unchallenged? How can he describe Assyria as an instrument of judgment and then condemn Assyria because being used within history does not make an empire righteous? How can Babylon become the place of exile and still eventually fall? Because no empire is permanent. How can Israel be God's servant and yet need another servant to restore it? Because calling and faithfulness are not automatically the same thing. How can a servant suffer and still be victorious? Because divine victory does not always resemble imperial victory. How can judgment lead to hope? Because judgment exposes what must be transformed. Isaiah's prophecies are therefore not isolated predictions scattered across 66 chapters. They form an argument. Human beings repeatedly build security on what cannot last. God repeatedly exposes those foundations. Then he preserves, restores, and redirects history towards something greater. That pattern appears politically. Ahaz trusts Assyria. Assyria becomes dangerous. Hezekiah considers foreign support. Foreign alliances prove unreliable. Babylon appears impressive. Babylon itself will not last forever. The pattern appears spiritually. Judah trusts ceremony. Ceremony cannot substitute for justice. People trust idols. Idols cannot speak or save. Leaders trust status. Status cannot survive judgment. The pattern appears even in the monarchy. The people trust kings. Kings die. Some kings fail catastrophically. Isaiah therefore keeps directing the eyes of Judah beyond the visible, not away from history, beyond its false absolutes. And this is where his legacy becomes inseparable from the figure of the Messiah. Isaiah's royal prophecies arise from the failures of real kings. The promise is not floating in empty theological space. It is born from disappointment. Ahaz occupies David's throne, but does not embody faithful trust. Hezekiah displays genuine faith, yet remains imperfect. Manasseh becomes associated with grave corruption. If the Davidic promise is going to mean anything larger than the repetition of flawed rulers, a different kind of king is needed. Isaiah speaks of a child whose rule will be associated with justice and peace. He speaks of a shoot emerging from Jesse's stump. The Spirit rests upon this ruler. He judges the poor with righteousness. He does not govern by outward appearances. His reign reaches toward a peace so deep that the natural world itself becomes part of the prophetic imagery. The expectation becomes greater than ordinary monarchy, and later generations continue asking, who could fulfill such a vision? For Christians, the answer centers on Jesus. The Gospel writers repeatedly make that connection. Matthew reads the sign of Immanuel in relation to Jesus' birth. The child born in Isaiah's historical crisis becomes part of a larger claim, God with us. But that connection is not meaningful because Matthew ignored Isaiah's original world. It is meaningful because the house of David remained central to the promise. The crisis under Ahaz raised a question about the future of that house. The Christian claim is that the question ultimately finds its answer in Jesus. Isaiah 9 contributes another layer, a son associated with Davidic rule, a kingdom characterized by justice, peace without end. Again, the Christian reading sees Jesus not simply as another ruler in David's succession, but as the one in whom the Davidic hope reaches its intended scale. Isaiah 11 makes the connection even more direct through Jesse. A shoot from Jesse's line, a spirit-endowed ruler, a hope reaching the nations. Paul later quotes this vision in Romans when discussing Gentile hope. The point is larger than personal ancestry. The Davidic promise becomes global. And then Isaiah's servant songs reshape the entire expectation. What does the Messiah do with human sin? Political kings can defeat enemies. They cannot solve guilt. Military victory can preserve borders. It cannot cleanse hearts. Reform can improve institutions. It cannot permanently cure rebellion. Isaiah's suffering servant addresses a deeper problem. He carries grief. He bears wrongdoing. He suffers. He is rejected. He is cut off. And yet his suffering leads toward justification and vindication. For the New Testament writers, this becomes indispensable for understanding the crucifixion. The cross appears at first to contradict kingship. Isaiah helps reinterpret it. The servant's suffering is not a detour from the mission. It belongs to the mission. The Messiah does not simply save by defeating enemies outside the people. He confronts the sin within them. This becomes one of the most important bridges between Isaiah and Christian theology. Isaiah's vision of salvation is not merely geopolitical. It includes forgiveness, cleansing, transformation, restoration, justice, the nations, and ultimately, creation itself. That is why the servant cannot remain only a political liberator. The problem is too large. And this also explains why Isaiah becomes so influential in the New Testament. His words appear at moments when early Christians are trying to explain who Jesus is and what his mission means. John the Baptist is associated with the voice preparing the way. Jesus reads Isaiah's proclamation of good news. The servant songs illuminate his suffering. The Davidic prophecies illuminate his kingship. The light to the nations illuminates the expanding mission of the church. The remnant theme helps Paul think through Israel's place within God's continuing purpose. And Isaiah's new creation language helps shape the final hope of Revelation. Few books provide so much of the vocabulary of Christian salvation. But Isaiah's legacy is larger than a collection of messianic references. His message continues to challenge the people who quote him. It is possible to admire Isaiah 53 while ignoring Isaiah 1. It is possible to celebrate the suffering servant while neglecting the prophet's demand for justice. It is possible to speak about future restoration while reproducing the very injustice Isaiah condemned in his own society. That would miss the coherence of his message. Isaiah never separates salvation from holiness. The God who saves is the Holy One. The people who receive mercy are called toward righteousness. The restored community must not reproduce the corruption that helped bring judgment. This is why Isaiah 58 remains such an important part of the book. People fast. They seek religious experience. They want God to respond. But they continue exploitation and conflict. Isaiah tells them that true devotion cannot be detached from mercy. Share bread with the hungry. Care for the vulnerable. Break oppressive patterns. Religious practice without transformed relationships becomes another form of self-deception. That message belongs in the same book as the servant songs. The connection is not accidental. If salvation restores people to God, it must also change the way people treat one another. This is Isaiah's ethical legacy. Holiness is never merely private. Justice is not optional decoration around worship. The prophet's social accusations were not temporary political opinions. They flowed from his theology of God. A holy God cares what powerful people do to the weak. A holy God cannot be bribed with religious performance. A holy God sees both the altar and the courtroom. That is why Isaiah can describe corrupt rulers and false worship in the same breath. For him, covenant life is integrated. And this makes his message uncomfortable in every age. Religious people can quote Isaiah while needing Isaiah's rebuke. Political leaders can invoke God while needing Isaiah's warning about pride. Nations can celebrate strength while needing Isaiah's reminder that empires are temporary. Individuals can seek comfort while resisting repentance. Isaiah refuses to let any audience take only the part of his message that feels convenient. Comfort comes after the truth about judgment. Hope comes without denial. Mercy does not erase moral seriousness. This balance is perhaps nowhere clearer than in the image of the remnant. At first glance, a remnant shall return sounds entirely hopeful. But a remnant exists only because something devastating happened. The word contains grief. Much has been lost. Yet it also contains promise. Not everything has been lost. Isaiah uses this idea repeatedly because it prevents two opposite errors. The first error says, because God has made promises, judgment cannot happen. Isaiah rejects that. The second says, because judgment has happened, the promise must be dead. Isaiah rejects that too. The remnant stands between presumption and despair. It says that consequences are real and grace remains. This pattern shapes the biblical story far beyond Isaiah. Judah eventually does go into exile. Jerusalem falls to Babylon in the generations after Isaiah. The temple is destroyed. Royal rule collapses. For anyone who had assumed Jerusalem could never fall, the catastrophe must have seemed like theological collapse. Yet the exile does not end the story. A remnant returns. Jerusalem is rebuilt. Temple worship resumes. The community survives. Isaiah's comfort language suddenly sounds less like poetry and more like a theological map. Prepare the way. Fear not. You are mine. Comfort my people. The words become tools for surviving catastrophe. And the return from exile confirms something Isaiah had insisted all along. Empires are temporary. Babylon had once appeared dominant. Then Persia rose. Cyrus became associated with the return. Political power shifted again. The map changed. But the prophetic question remained the same. Who truly rules? Isaiah's answer had already been given decades earlier in the temple. The throne above history had never been empty. Yet even the return from Babylon failed to fulfill every dimension of Isaiah's hope. The people came back, but the world was not completely transformed. A Davidic king did not simply resume an independent eternal kingdom. The nations had not fully laid down war. Death had not been swallowed forever. Creation had not yet become new. That gap between partial restoration and ultimate hope kept Isaiah's prophecies open. The return from exile was real fulfillment, but it did not exhaust the vision. This is another reason later Jewish and Christian readers continued looking forward. Isaiah had promised more than one historical return could accomplish. Peace among nations, a righteous Davidic ruler, a servant bringing light to the ends of the earth. Death defeated, new creation. The horizon remained ahead. For Christians, Jesus becomes the decisive turning point in that unfinished expectation. But even within Christian theology, the story is not considered fully complete at Jesus' first coming. The New Testament continues looking forward. The kingdom has come, and the kingdom will come in fullness. Salvation has begun, and creation still waits. Christ has risen, and death still has to be finally removed from the human experience. This already not yet tension fits naturally within Isaiah's prophetic architecture. Isaiah frequently sees events in large panoramic form. Near and far horizons can appear together. Historical deliverance and ultimate restoration can share imagery. This does not mean every prophetic detail should be forced into one chronology. It means prophetic vision often sees the direction of God's purpose without giving the kind of timeline a modern reader might demand. Isaiah gives us a destination, and many stages lie between the prophet and its completion. That final destination is expressed most powerfully through new creation. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. The language is among the boldest in the Old Testament. Isaiah's story began in a corrupted Jerusalem. It ends with a transformed horizon. The prophet has moved from one city's injustice toward the renewal of creation itself. That movement reveals how large the biblical diagnosis has become. The problem is not just Judah, not just Assyria, not just Babylon. Human rebellion has affected the world at a deeper level. Therefore, the final restoration must also be deeper. Isaiah describes joy, peace, fruitfulness, security, a world no longer defined by the patterns of devastation his generation knew so well. And when Revelation later describes a new heaven and a new earth, the echo is unmistakable. The final book of the Christian Bible reaches backward to Isaiah while looking forward to the end of the biblical story. The prophetic hope becomes part of the Bible's final vocabulary. What began with Isaiah standing before a throne now culminates in a vision where divine presence defines an entire renewed creation. That gives Isaiah's ministry an extraordinary arc. At the beginning, a man realizes he is unclean. At the end, creation itself is being renewed. At the beginning, one prophet needs cleansing. At the end, nations are being gathered. At the beginning, a king has died. At the end, the kingdom of God is the enduring reality. At the beginning, smoke fills the temple. At the end, the glory of God fills the horizon of hope. Between those endpoints, Isaiah never forgets the human cost of rebellion. This is why his book continues to sound both beautiful and severe. Some passages comfort, others unsettle. Some are quoted at Christmas, others belong to scenes of invasion and judgment. Some speak of peace, others speak of ruined cities. Some speak of a child, others of a suffering servant. Some announce forgiveness, others condemn hypocrisy with brutal clarity. All of these belong to the same prophet. Removing the judgment produces a shallow Isaiah. Removing the hope produces an incomplete Isaiah. Removing the historical context turns him into a codebook of predictions. Removing his later biblical influence cuts him off from the very canon that preserved his words. The complete Isaiah requires all of it. The man, the history, the kings, the empires, the warnings, the songs, the servant, the Messiah, the nations, the new creation, and even the uncertainty around his death. That uncertainty deserves one final consideration. Why did later generations remember Isaiah as a martyr? Part of the answer may be historical tradition. Part of it may be the natural association between Isaiah's uncompromising message and the violent reign attributed to Manasseh. Part of it may come from Hebrews and other ancient literature. But the memory also expresses something true about prophetic vocation more generally. Prophets are rarely dangerous because they possess armies. They are dangerous because they refuse to let power define truth. Isaiah could stand before a king and tell him that the strategy he trusted was wrong. He could tell the wealthy that prosperity did not prove righteousness. He could tell a religious city that worship had become empty. He could tell an empire that its victories did not make it sovereign. He could tell frightened people not to fear what everyone else feared. That kind of message creates enemies. Whether Isaiah ultimately died by the exact method later tradition describes or not, he belongs to the biblical pattern of messengers whose faithfulness placed them in conflict with power. And Hebrews itself places such people within a larger community of faith. Some conquered kingdoms, some escaped swords, others suffered. Some were imprisoned, some were killed. Faithfulness does not always produce the same earthly outcome. That truth fits Isaiah perfectly. Jerusalem is delivered in one generation. Later Jerusalem falls. Hezekiah is healed. Other righteous people die. A prophet can announce rescue and still become a victim of persecution. Faith is not a formula guaranteeing immediate safety. Isaiah never taught that. His own calling should prevent us from assuming it. He volunteered knowing almost nothing about the cost. The cost unfolded across decades. But if the ancient martyrdom tradition preserves even the broad truth that Isaiah eventually suffered because of his prophetic faithfulness, then his ending carries one final irony. The king who supposedly silenced him could not stop him from speaking, because Isaiah continued speaking through the scroll. Century after century, generation after generation, when Judah went into exile, Isaiah spoke. When exiles needed comfort, Isaiah spoke. When people returned, Isaiah spoke. When Jewish communities wrestled with hope under foreign empires, Isaiah spoke. When John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, the Gospels heard Isaiah. When Jesus stood in Nazareth, he read Isaiah. When early Christians tried to understand the cross, they returned to Isaiah. When the gospel moved toward Gentiles, Acts, and Paul returned to Isaiah. When Christians imagined the final renewal of creation, Revelation echoed Isaiah. The prophet died, the word traveled. That may be the most fitting way to understand Isaiah's true legacy. He did not build an empire. He did not found a dynasty. He did not command an army. He did not leave a palace. He left a prophetic vision large enough to survive the destruction of the world that first heard it. And that vision still carries a warning. No civilization is permanent simply because it is powerful. Assyria was not. Babylon was not. No leader becomes ultimate because people fear him. Ahaz was not. Hezekiah was not. Manasseh was not. No religious institution is safe merely because it is ancient. Jerusalem itself faced judgment. No people can replace righteousness with ritual indefinitely. Isaiah condemned that illusion from the beginning. But the same vision carries hope. Failure does not automatically erase every promise. A remnant can survive. A stump can produce a branch. A wilderness can become a road. A barren place can bloom. Captives can hear good news. Those sitting in darkness can see light. A servant can suffer and yet be vindicated. Nations once separated can be drawn toward peace, and even death does not have to be the last enemy standing. That is why Isaiah's prophecies remain so difficult to reduce to one subject. He is a prophet of judgment and hope, a prophet of kings and servants, a prophet of Judah and the nations, a prophet of history and new creation. His message begins locally and ends universally. It moves from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. This breadth explains why many people encounter Isaiah without realizing how often they are encountering him. Holy, holy, holy. Immanuel. Unto us a child is born, a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Comfort my people. A voice crying in the wilderness. Those who wait upon the Lord. A light to the nations. Wounded for our transgressions. Good news to the poor. A house of prayer for all nations. New heavens and a new earth. These phrases belong to different parts of Isaiah's prophetic world, but together they have shaped centuries of biblical imagination. Yet perhaps the single thread connecting all of them is the one Isaiah discovered in the temple. God is greater than the crisis, greater than the king, greater than the empire, greater than the judgment, greater than the prophet. Isaiah could therefore confront the present because he had seen reality from a different perspective. Earthly thrones become vacant. The throne he saw did not. That belief gave him courage. It also gave him humility. Isaiah was never the center. This is why his first response to holiness was confession, not ambition. The prophet who later spoke to nations began by admitting his own uncleanness. That detail may be one of the most important reasons Isaiah's moral authority remains compelling. He does not proclaim judgment from the position of someone who believes he never needed mercy. He needed cleansing first. Only then was he sent. The pattern matters for anyone who wants to use Isaiah only to condemn others. Before Isaiah said woe to a nation, he said, woe is me. Before the prophetic mouth spoke against corruption, it was touched by the coal. The messenger was included in the need for grace. And perhaps this is the point where Isaiah's life and message meet most powerfully. Holiness exposes. Grace cleanses. Cleansing leads to mission. Mission requires faithfulness. Faithfulness may bring suffering, but suffering does not cancel the purpose. The servant shows this. The prophet may have lived it, and the biblical story later places the same pattern at the center of the Christian understanding of Jesus. Suffering before glory, death before resurrection, rejection before vindication. The world repeatedly mistakes the middle of the story for the end. Isaiah refuses that mistake. Assyria looked final. It was not. Exile would look final. It was not. The fall of Jerusalem would look final. It was not. The collapse of Davidic rule would look final. It was not. The suffering servant would appear cut off. That would not be the final movement. Even death itself appears in Isaiah as an enemy destined to be swallowed. The prophet's entire theology insists that what looks final to human beings may only be one stage within a larger purpose. This does not minimize suffering. Isaiah knows destruction is real. He describes it vividly. Cities can burn, people can be deported, kings can fail, prophets can suffer. The promise is not that pain is imaginary. The promise is that pain is not sovereign. That difference is everything. For Isaiah's original audience, that meant Assyria did not own the future. For later exiles, it meant Babylon did not own the future. For early Christians, it meant Rome did not own the future. For generations reading Isaiah after the rise and fall of countless powers, the message remains recognizable. The names of empires change. The temptation does not. People still trust wealth, political power, military strength, institutions, cultural influence, their own wisdom. Isaiah asks the ancient question again. What happens when the thing you trust is revealed to be temporary? His answer is not withdrawal from the world. Isaiah is intensely concerned with the world. Justice, leadership, worship, war, the poor, the nations, public corruption. Isaiah does not say none of these things matter because only heaven matters. He says they matter precisely because the Holy One rules over them. Faith, therefore, changes how life is lived inside history, not outside it. That is why the prophet's hope for the future is tied to righteousness in the present. The future king judges justly. The restored people care for the oppressed. The house of prayer welcomes the nations. The servant brings justice. The vision of peace challenges the logic of endless warfare. Isaiah's future is morally connected to Isaiah's present, and this may be the best way to remember him. Not merely as the man who predicted things, but as the prophet who taught generations how to interpret history. He taught them that prosperity can hide decay, that fear can disguise itself as strategy, that religious language can disguise unbelief, that empires can mistake temporary success for permanent greatness, that judgment can be deserved without becoming the end of hope, that restoration requires more than returning to old habits, that the people of God need both forgiveness and transformation, that leadership must be measured by righteousness, not only effectiveness, that divine power can appear through suffering rather than domination, and that history is moving toward a future larger than any one nation's survival. This is the complete arc of Isaiah. He begins under Uzziah. A king dies, a prophet sees the Lord, he receives cleansing, he accepts the commission, then the world changes around him. Jotham rules, Ahaz trembles. Aram and Israel threaten Judah, Assyria rises, Ahaz chooses imperial protection, Damascus falls, Samaria collapses, the northern kingdom disappears. Hezekiah reforms Judah, Assyria invades, Lachish falls, Jerusalem waits. The Rabshakeh mocks. Hezekiah prays. Isaiah speaks. Jerusalem survives. Hezekiah becomes ill. He recovers. Babylon sends envoys. Isaiah looks beyond Assyria toward exile. Then prophecy reaches farther still. Comfort, return, Cyrus, a new exodus, a servant, a light to the nations, a suffering figure, restored Zion, good news, a spirit-anointed mission, a feast for the peoples, death swallowed up, new creation, And finally, the prophet himself passes into silence, perhaps violently, perhaps in the manner ancient tradition remembers, but Scripture leaves the final details unstated. The result is almost poetic. Isaiah's last recorded moment is less important than his last enduring word. His body disappears from the story. His vision expands. That is his true ending. And it is why calling Isaiah only a prophet of doom is wrong. He saw judgment clearly, but he also saw beyond it. Calling him only a prophet of hope is equally incomplete. His hope has weight because he refused to minimize sin. Calling him only a messianic prophet also misses much of his ministry. He confronted real rulers in real crises before his words became central to later messianic interpretation. The complete Isaiah is all of these at once: historical prophet, royal counselor, covenant prosecutor, poet, visionary, critic of injustice, prophet of the remnant, voice of comfort, witness to the servant, prophet of the nations, herald of new creation, and a man whose final fate remains partly hidden behind the boundary between Scripture and tradition. That boundary should remain visible. It protects both truth and reverence. We do not honor Isaiah by inventing certainty where Scripture gives none. We honor his message by handling it with the same seriousness he demanded from his hearers. What can we say with confidence? Isaiah served during a critical period in Judah's history. He confronted kings. His ministry spanned major political transitions. His prophecies interpreted Assyria's rise and warned of Babylonian exile. He proclaimed both judgment and restoration. His book became one of the most influential prophetic texts in Judaism and Christianity. The New Testament repeatedly uses his language when interpreting Jesus and the mission to the nations. What can we say carefully? Ancient tradition associates Isaiah with martyrdom under Manasseh, often specifically by being sawn apart. Hebrews 11 may preserve an echo consistent with that tradition, but does not identify Isaiah by name. What remains unknown? The exact circumstances, date, and manner of Isaiah's death. And perhaps this is enough. Because the final measure of Isaiah's life was never the way he died, it was the faithfulness with which he answered the call. He saw a holy king. He recognized his need for mercy. He was cleansed, he was sent, he spoke. Not every king listened. Not every warning produced repentance. Not every generation changed. Judgment still came, but Isaiah's mission was not wasted. The word survived the resistance. It survived the prophet. It survived the kingdom. It survived exile. It crossed languages. It crossed centuries. And for Christian readers, it eventually pointed them toward Jesus, toward a king unlike Ahaz, a servant unlike Assyria, a salvation deeper than political survival, and a kingdom larger than Judah. Isaiah began with a nation in danger. He ended with a world made new. That distance tells us almost everything about the scale of his prophetic imagination, from one throne room in Jerusalem to the destiny of the nations, from one prophet's unclean lips to a servant bearing the sins of many, from the death of one king to the promise of a kingdom of peace, from the threat of one empire to the end of death itself, from a doomed city to new creation, and behind every stage remains the same vision. The Holy One is still on the throne. That is why Isaiah could warn. That is why Isaiah could hope. That is why his words endured. If this journey through Isaiah has helped you see his prophecies as one connected story rather than isolated verses, tell us which biblical prophet, king, or book should receive the complete documentary treatment next. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the Bible through its full historical and theological storyline, and continue with the next documentary to see how the warnings Isaiah gave about Babylon eventually became reality, and how exile transformed the story of Judah forever. Isaiah's voice eventually fell silent. The kings he confronted died. The empire he feared disappeared. The city he loved would one day fall, but the promise continued.